When the Coast Guard finally boarded her, a meal was still laid out in the galley, and the entire crew was gone. The sea off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, holds its secrets below the waterline. The shoals there are shallow and treacherous, the kind of place sailors have named with quiet dread for centuries. Diamond Shoals, the graveyard of the Atlantic. Names earned through wreckage and loss, through the slow accumulation of ships that went down without explanation, and men who were never found. The waters are grey more often than they are blue. They move with a kind of heavy purpose, as if the ocean itself knows that this stretch of coast is a place where things disappear. It was the last day of January, 1921, when a surfman named C.O. Brady spotted the five-masted schooner from the shore. She was moving strangely, drifting without purpose, her sails half raised in a way that suggested no one was tending them. The vessel appeared to be on a collision course with the outer shoals. Brady watched her for a long moment. Something about the way she moved was wrong. Not the movement of a ship in distress, not a vessel struggling against the sea. Something quieter than that. Something that suggested the ship was simply empty. He sent word to the Cape Hatteras Coast Guard station. A rescue boat was launched into the surf. But the sea was running too high, the waves too violent, and the Coast Guard crew could not reach her that day. They watched as the Carroll A, steering ground slowly onto Diamond Shoals, her hull settling into the sand with a sound that must have carried across the water like a long, tired exhalation. It would be 2 more days before anyone could board her. 2 days in which the ship sat on those shoals, her red hull visible from the shore, her sails moving gently in the winter wind, and no one at her helm. When the Coast Guard finally climbed aboard on the 1st of February, they found the galley stove still warm. A pot of food was cooking, the table was set. Dinner was ready and waiting, as if the crew had simply stepped away for a moment and expected to return. They never did. This is the story of the Carroll A. Deering, a ghost ship off the coast of North Carolina, a mystery that drew the attention of 5 government agencies and was never solved, a story of the sea and of the particular kind of silence that settles over a vessel when the people who gave her life have gone. You are resting now. Let that be enough. Whatever the day required of you has already been given, and the world outside this moment can wait until morning. There is nothing to solve tonight, nothing to carry. Only this story and the quiet it brings with it. Settle yourself a little more deeply. Feel the weight of your body, the particular comfort of whatever surface holds you. Notice the sounds around you, near and far, and let them become part of the background, the way the sound of the ocean becomes part of the air in a coastal town. Present, but not demanding. There. If you enjoy listening to stories like this, subscribe. New stories are posted every week, and the next one will be waiting for you when you return. The year is 1921, and the world is still shaking off the dust of the Great War. The shipping lanes along the eastern seaboard of the United States are busy with commerce, with cargo vessels and fishing boats, and the occasional passenger ship moving through the grey Atlantic waters. It is a time of transition, a time when the old ways of doing things are being replaced by the new, when the great age of sail is giving way to the age of steam, and the wooden-hulled schooners that once ruled these waters are growing fewer in number every year. The Carroll A. Deering is one of the last of her kind, a 5-masted commercial schooner built in 1919 at the G.G. Deering Company shipyard in Bath, Maine. She is a handsome vessel, nearly 200 feet long, with a hull painted red and white, her 5 great masts rising from her deck like the fingers of an open hand. She is built for carrying cargo, for the slow, reliable work of moving goods from one port to another along the eastern coast of the Americas. She is new enough that her timbers still smell faintly of the sawmill, but old enough in design to belong to a tradition that stretches back centuries. She is named for the son of her builder, Charles A. Deering. She is registered out of Portland, Maine. And in the summer of 1920, she sets out on what will be her last voyage, a cargo run to Rio de Janeiro and back, under the command of a captain she has never sailed with before. That captain is not the man who brought her into service. Her original captain, Merritt, fell ill before she could depart and had to be replaced at short notice. The man who takes command instead is William Merritt's replacement, a 66-year-old veteran of the sea named Willis Wormel. Captain Wormel has spent most of his life on the water, but he is not in the best of health, and some who know him wonder if this voyage will be too much. He takes the command anyway. Sailors of his generation do not rest when there is work to be done. The crew assembled for the voyage is a mixed collection of men, 10 in number, drawn from the maritime labour pools of the eastern seaboard. Among them is the first mate Charles McClellan, a man about whom there will later be much said, some of it charitable, some of it not. The relationship between McClellan and Captain Wormel will become one of the central threads of the mystery, a thread that will be pulled at by investigators for years without ever unravelling completely. You do not need to hold all of this in your mind at once. Let it settle gently, the way a ship settles at anchor. The story will unfold at its own pace, one detail at a time, and by the time we reach the end of it, you will know as much as anyone has ever known about what happened to the Carroll A. Deering, which is to say, you will know a great deal and understand very little. That is the nature of this particular mystery, and perhaps that is all right. Some things are meant to remain at the bottom of the sea. A schooner is a particular kind of ship, and it is worth taking a moment to understand what that means, to feel the reality of it, before we follow the Carroll A. Deering out to sea. Unlike a square-rigged sailing vessel, which catches the wind in sails hung perpendicular to the ship's central axis, a schooner is rigged fore and aft, meaning her sails are strung along the length of the ship, parallel to her spine. This arrangement makes her nimble, easier to maneuver with a small crew, better suited to the shallow coastal waters and unpredictable winds of the American eastern seaboard. A five-master like the Carroll A. Deering is among the largest of her type, a working vessel of serious commercial ambition, built to carry thousands of tons of cargo across long distances without the massive crew that a square rigger of comparable size would require. Think of her deck on a calm day. The wooden planks are worn smooth from years of use, the grain of the timber softened by salt water and foot traffic by the patient accumulation of weather. The smell is one of the particular smells of the sea, tar and salt and wet rope, the faint iron smell of the anchor chain coiled in its locker below, the deeper, older smell of the timber itself, the resin that still lives in the wood even after the sawmill and the shipyard have had their way with it. The sails, when they are lowered and at rest, have the dusty sun-bleached smell of heavy canvas that has been in weather. The ship's interior is modest. The captain's quarters are aft, a small cabin with a bunk and a writing desk, a porthole looking out over the ship's wake. The crew sleeps in the forecastle, the space below the forward deck, in narrow bunks stacked close together, the kind of quarters where you learn to sleep through anything, because the alternative is to lie awake, listening to the sounds of a ship in motion, the groaning of the timbers, the slap of water against the hull, the creak of the rigging overhead. It is not comfortable, exactly, but it is familiar, and familiarity becomes its own kind of comfort over a long voyage. The galley is the heart of the ship in the way that a kitchen is the heart of any home where people spend their lives together in close quarters. It is a small, low-ceilinged room amidships, heated by a cast-iron stove that burns coal and serves double duty as the ship's only reliable source of warmth in cold weather. The cook is in some ways the most important man aboard after the captain, because food on a long ocean voyage is the thing that holds a crew together, the reliable pleasure in days that can otherwise become a long grey sameness of water and wind. The Carroll A. Deering carries a cook named Herbert Bates on her final voyage. He is, by most accounts, a competent man who takes his responsibilities seriously. He would have known that a well-fed crew is a crew that does not complain, that does not grow sullen and difficult, that keeps the peace in the tight quarters of a working vessel. He would have planned his menus with the available stores, balancing the need for nutrition against the realities of what could be kept at sea without spoiling. He would have known the rhythms of his ship's schedule, when to start the stove, when to have the food ready, how to time a meal so that it was hot when the watch changed and hungry men came below. The cook's skill mattered. And on the day the Coast Guard boarded the empty ship, the stove in Herbert Bates's galley was still warm, and the food he had prepared was still sitting there, waiting to be eaten. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us begin at the beginning. The Carroll A. Deering departs from Portland, Maine, in the summer of 1920. Her cargo hold is loaded with freight intended for South America. Her crew of 10 men settles into the rhythms of a long ocean voyage. Captain Willis Wormel takes his station and begins the work of navigating a large sailing vessel across thousands of miles of open Atlantic water. The voyage south is largely uneventful. The Deering makes good time, the winds being reasonably cooperative, and by the autumn of 1920, she reaches Rio de Janeiro. The cargo is offloaded. The ship takes on provisions for the return journey. The crew has a few days in port, which is always a complicated thing with sailors, a mixture of rest and relief, and the particular kind of trouble that men who have been at sea for months find when they have money in their pockets and solid ground under their feet. It is in Rio de Janeiro that the first signs of trouble aboard the Deering begin to surface. The relationship between Captain Warmel and First Mate McClellan has apparently deteriorated during the southward voyage. Sources differ on the exact nature of the tension, but what seems clear is that McClellan is a difficult man, one of those individuals whose presence on a ship creates friction rather than resolving it. He is, by various accounts, quick-tempered, given to drink when opportunity allows, and unwilling to defer to authority in the way that the hierarchy of a sailing vessel requires. Captain Warmel, for his part, is not a young man, and he is not well. The voyage has been taxing. He is described by those who knew him as a careful, experienced sailor, a man who knows his business but who perhaps lacks the physical vigour to impose his will on a recalcitrant crew the way a younger captain might. The dynamic between them, a tired and unwell captain and a difficult and possibly insubordinate first mate, is not a recipe for harmony on a long ocean voyage. In Rio, Captain Warmel meets with an old acquaintance named Goodwin, a man in the shipping business, and apparently confides in him that he is having trouble with his mate. The exact words he uses are not recorded, but the impression Goodwin receives is serious enough that he will remember the conversation later when the ship disappears. He will tell investigators that Warmel seemed worried, not panicked, not frightened in any obvious way, but quietly, persistently concerned, in the manner of a man who has a problem he does not know how to solve. What was that problem exactly? That is one of the questions that will hang over this story like the low cloud that settles over the Carolina coast in winter, obscuring the horizon, softening the line between sea and sky until you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. We know that something was wrong aboard the Deering before she left South America. We do not know what, precisely. We know that Warmel was worried. We do not know what, precisely, he feared. The ship takes on her return cargo and prepares to depart Rio de Janeiro. The crew reassembles. The provisions are loaded. The cook Bates begins planning the meals that will carry 10 men across the Atlantic and up the eastern seaboard of North America. Captain Warmel gives the order to raise sail. The Deering moves out of the harbour and into open water, turning her bow northward toward home. Behind her, Rio de Janeiro slowly diminishes, the bright colours of the port fading into the general blue-green of distance. Ahead, the Atlantic opens up, enormous and impersonal, the same ocean it has always been, indifferent to the small dramas playing out on the surface of its water. The ship sails north. The weeks pass. The crew does whatever it is that crews do on long ocean voyages, the endless maintenance, the watch rotations, the meals in the cramped galley, the sleeping and waking, and sleeping again to the rhythm of the sea. The Deering passes through the Caribbean, rounds the northern coast of Cuba, enters the waters of the Gulf Stream that runs up along the eastern seaboard. She is heading home, and then she is not. Somewhere between the warm blue waters of the Caribbean and the cold grey Atlantic off the coast of North Carolina, something happens. Something that leaves the ship empty of everyone who sailed her, with dinner still warm on the stove, and the sea offering no explanation. The cold January wind carries its particular smell across Diamond Shoals as the surfman Brady watches from the shore. The schooner drifts, her sails move, no one answers from her deck. Something happened. We are going to try to find out what, and if we cannot find out, we will at least understand the shape of the mystery, the way a blind man understands a room by feeling the walls, by knowing where the spaces are, by learning what is not there as much as what is. Barbados is a particular kind of beautiful, the kind of beauty that comes from the meeting of warm water and trade wind, from the particular shade of blue that the Caribbean achieves in winter, from the white foam that the surf throws up against the coral beaches. It is a beauty that has nothing to do with the concerns of the mainland, with the complications of commerce and command, with the tensions that have apparently been building aboard the Carroll A. Deering during the long weeks of her return voyage from Rio. The Deering puts in at Barbados on the 9th of January 1921. This is her last confirmed port of call, the last place where any member of her crew will be seen alive by someone who can later testify to what they observed. Everything that is known about the state of the ship and her people at this point comes from the accounts gathered here, in the harbour of Bridgetown, in the days before the Deering raises her anchor and sails north toward what will become one of the great unsolved mysteries of American maritime history. Let yourself rest a little more deeply as we arrive in Bridgetown. Imagine the harbour in early January, the warm air, the particular quality of light in the tropics, where the sun sits high and the shadows are short and dark even in winter. The Deering is anchored among the other vessels in the harbour, her red hull bright against the blue-green water. The sounds of the port carry across the water, voices in English and Barbadian dialect, the knock of small boats against larger hulls, the cry of seabirds overhead. It is here that Captain Warmel's concerns about his first mate will become a matter of record. Warmel goes ashore in Barbados and pays a visit to the American consul, a man named Lula. This is not an unusual thing for a ship's captain to do at a port of call. The consul is a representative of the government back home, a contact in foreign waters, someone who can help with paperwork and official business. But Warmel's visit to Consul Lula in Barbados has a different quality to it. He is not there for paperwork. He is there because he needs to tell someone what is happening on his ship. What exactly he tells Lula is known through the consul's later account to investigators. The substance of it is this. Captain Warmel is deeply troubled by the behaviour of his first mate, Charles McClellan. McClellan has been drinking. He has been insubordinate. There has apparently been an incident, or several incidents, in which McClellan has either threatened mutiny or behaved in a way that suggested he might. Warmel is afraid of what McClellan might do. The word mutiny has a particular weight in the history of the sea. It is one of the oldest and most serious crimes in maritime law, a violation not just of authority but of the compact that holds a crew together on the open ocean, where the alternative to order is chaos, and chaos at sea means death. Mutiny has happened enough times in the history of sailing to be a genuine fear, not a theoretical one, and captains who have served for decades develop a sensitivity to the signs of it, the way a farmer develops a sensitivity to the signs of coming weather. Warmel believes McClellan is dangerous. He tells Consul Lula this. He asks, apparently, whether there is anything that can be done, whether McClellan can be removed from the ship before she sails north. Lula's response is, by all accounts, sympathetic but not immediately helpful. The consul does not have the authority to remove a first mate from a private vessel on the basis of a captain's complaint alone. There would need to be some legal process, some formal proceeding, and the Deering schedule does not allow for that kind of delay. Warmel leaves the consulate without having resolved his problem. He returns to his ship. McClellan remains aboard. Consider what this means for the captain. He is 66 years old and not in good health. He is responsible for 10 men and a valuable ship on a voyage that still has the better part of 2,000 miles remaining. He has, by his own account to the consul, a first mate he fears, and there is nothing he can do about it. He has to sail anyway. The cargo has been delivered, the ship needs to return, and captains of his generation do not walk away from their commands because the situation has become difficult. You sail the ship you have, with the crew you have, in the weather the sea gives you. There is a quiet courage in that, and a quiet sadness. The accounts from Barbados also include observations about McClellan himself. Several people in the port reported seeing the first mate ashore, and their descriptions of him are not flattering. He was, by multiple accounts, visibly intoxicated, loud, and difficult. He was reported to have made statements that alarmed people who heard them, statements about the captain, about the voyage, about what he intended to do. The exact words vary depending on who is recounting them, but the general impression is consistent. McClellan was a man whose behaviour at this point in the voyage was at minimum concerning, and possibly alarming. One account, which has been repeated in most tellings of this story, has McClellan declaring that he would put the captain in irons before the voyage was done, or words to that effect. Whether this was bluster and frustration vented in a portside bar, or something more purposeful and premeditated, is impossible to say at this distance. What is clear is that enough people heard something like this that it became part of the record. Now, here is the thing about Barbados that you need to hold in your mind as this story continues. The Deering leaves Barbados on the 9th of January, 1921. She is last positively sighted a short time later, but by January 23 she passes the Cape Fear lightship, which is a lightship anchored off the North Carolina coast to mark the entrance to the Cape Fear River. The lightship crew observes the Deering passing and notes that the ship appears to be in order. She is proceeding normally, her sails set appropriately for the conditions, nothing outwardly amiss. But then comes the curious detail. One of the Deering's crew hails the lightship through a megaphone. Not the captain, not the first mate, but a crew member whose identity will be debated for years afterward. He shouts across the water that the Deering has lost both anchors and asks that a report be sent to company headquarters. He says this in a way that strikes the lightship crew as strange, in a way that does not quite match the calm appearance of the ship's progress. And there is something else, something that one of the lightship crew later describes as odd. The crew member who hailed them seemed to be speaking deliberately, as if making sure he was heard and understood, as if the message mattered. The lightship tries to contact the Deering by radio. No response. The lightship sends a signal to the shore station, but the station's own radio is malfunctioning that day, and the message cannot be passed along immediately, and the Deering sails on. She is observed one more time, on January 29, by a steamer called the S, Lake Elon, moving north along the same route. The steamer crew sees the Deering but does not make contact with her. She appears to be proceeding normally, sailing north, no outward sign of crisis. 2 days later, she is on Diamond Shoals, empty. What happened in those 2 days? What happened between the Cape Fear lightship and Diamond Shoals, between the message about lost anchors and the galley still warm with a meal no one would eat? That is the question. And the sea, as it always does, kept its answer. The warmth of the Barbados sun fades slowly as you let this part of the story settle. January 1921. A ship sailing north through cold Atlantic water. A captain who is afraid of his first mate. A first mate who may or may not have made threats. A meal cooking in the galley. And somewhere in the grey water between Cape Fear and Diamond Shoals, a silence that has never been broken. If you are still with me, drifting quietly through this story, I am glad. If sleep is already beginning to pull at the edges of your attention, let it. The story will still be here when you return. And if you would like more stories like this one, subscribe. New episodes are posted every week, and there is always another mystery waiting. Always another ship, another silence, another sea. The 1st of February 1921. The sea off Diamond Shoals has calmed enough from the storms of the previous days to allow a Coast Guard cutter to approach the stranded vessel. The men aboard the cutter are professionals, experienced in the difficult and sometimes dangerous work of maritime rescue along this stretch of coast. They have seen ships in distress before. They have boarded disabled vessels and found frightened, exhausted crews clinging to the rigging. They have, in the course of their work, discovered things they would rather not have discovered. Nothing quite prepares them for what they find on the Carroll A Deering. The boarding party secures a line to the Deering and climbs aboard. The ship is grounded firmly on the shoal, her hull taking the movement of the water in a way that is wrong for a vessel of her size, sitting at an angle that says she is not going anywhere under her own power. The red paint of her hull is still bright below the waterline where the water is clear, but above the waterline the hull shows the marks of weather and travel, the accumulated evidence of a long voyage. The boarding party makes their way to the deck. This is the moment. This is when the strangeness begins to reveal itself, not all at once, but in pieces, each one adding to a picture that becomes more unsettling the longer you look at it. The anchors are gone. This is consistent with the message transmitted from the ship near Cape Fear, the crew member who shouted across the water that both anchors had been lost, but the manner in which the anchors are missing is notable. The anchor chains have been severed, not tangled or broken in the way that an anchor lost in a storm might be lost. Severed, cut. The chain ends hanging in the hawse holes are cleanly terminated, as if someone took a tool to them deliberately. This is the first detail that does not quite fit the story of an accident. The boarding party moves to the captain's quarters. They are empty. Captain Wormel's personal effects are present. His charts, his papers, some personal items. But there is nothing to indicate where the captain has gone, or why, or whether he left willingly. His logbook is present, and this will become an important document in the investigation that follows. The last entries in the log are routine, recording the ship's position and progress in the dry, factual language of maritime record-keeping. There is no entry that says anything is wrong. The log simply stops, in the middle of a voyage that was not yet over. The navigation equipment is in disarray. The ship's compasses have been removed from their binnacles. The steering gear has been damaged. The binnacle itself, the housing that holds the compass on a sailing vessel, has been broken. This is not the kind of damage that a storm does to a ship. This is targeted damage. Damage to the specific equipment that would allow the ship to be navigated. Why would someone destroy the navigation equipment of a ship they intended to continue sailing? The boarding party descends to the galley, and here is where the story becomes the thing that people will remember. The detail that will be repeated in every retelling of the Carroll A, endearing mystery for the next 100 years. The galley stove is warm. It has not been long cold. The food that is on it, the food that Herbert Bates, the cook, prepared for the crew's meal, is still there, still arranged on the stove in the way a meal is arranged when it has been put there and left. Pots are present. Food is present. The table has been set, or at least the preparations for a meal have been made, and whoever was supposed to eat that meal did not eat it. They left in a hurry, or they were taken. Or something happened that interrupted the most ordinary moment of the ship's day, the moment when the cook signals that the meal is ready, and 10 men come down to the galley, and the food is served. And the business of eating happens the way it has happened at every mealtime on every voyage the ship has ever made. Except this time, the men did not come. Or they came and then went. Or something else happened that we cannot reconstruct from the evidence of a warm stove and uneaten food. The boarding party searches the rest of the ship. They find the crew's quarters, the forecastle where the men slept, and there is evidence of ordinary habitation, bunks used and rumpled, personal items present. Not the quarters of men who packed deliberately and left, more like the quarters of men who got up and did not come back. There is one more detail that the boarding party notices, and it will seem trivial at the time, and later will seem very strange. In the steering gear housing aft, where the machinery that controls the ship's rudder is located, they find evidence that the gear has been deliberately disabled. Not damaged by accident or by weather. Disabled, as if someone wanted to make sure the ship could not be steered. Combined with the severed anchor chains and the missing navigation instruments, this creates a picture of a ship that has been methodically rendered immovable and unsteerable. Someone did this. Someone who was aboard the Deering deliberately removed the ship's ability to navigate and stop itself. The boarding party makes their report. The Coast Guard notifies the relevant authorities. And the mystery that will occupy 5 federal government agencies, generate thousands of pages of investigation records, and remain unsolved to this day begins. Let that settle gently, like sediment in still water. A ship, a warm stove, a meal not eaten, anchor chains cut clean, navigation instruments gone, steering gear disabled, and no one, anywhere, to explain any of it. The sea moves around the grounded schooner, the shoal water shallow and green in the winter light. The Coast Guard cutter sits alongside, and the men who boarded her stand on her deck and look at each other, and the question that forms in each of their minds is the same question that will occupy everyone who ever hears this story. What happened here? Not how it could have happened, or what might have happened, but what actually happened in the specific unrecoverable reality of those final hours or days aboard the Carroll A, Deering, 10 men, a ship, a galley, a meal, and then nothing but the cold Atlantic wind moving through the rigging, and the waves breaking against the red hull on the shoal, and the particular silence that fills a vessel when the people who gave it life are gone. That silence is very old and very complete. Rest a little deeper now. The story continues, but slowly, the way the tide moves, without hurry. There is no need to hold anything tightly. Let the details drift past you and come to rest where they will. The mystery will still be here. It has been here for 100 years and it is not going anywhere. The United States government, when confronted with a mystery of this particular kind, does what governments do. It convenes committees, assigns agencies, and generates paperwork. What it does not reliably do is solve the problem. In the weeks and months following the discovery of the Carroll A, Deering, no fewer than 5 separate federal agencies become involved in investigating what happened. The State Department, the Treasury Department, the Department of Commerce, the Navy Department, and the Department of Justice all send representatives, gather evidence, interview witnesses, and produce reports. The investigation is, by any measure, thorough. By any measure other than that one, it is a failure. But before we arrive at the failure, let us walk with the investigators as they begin. There is something meditative about following the trail of a careful inquiry, even when, perhaps especially when, the trail eventually runs cold. The process of investigation is itself a kind of story, a story about what human beings do when they encounter something they cannot explain. The investigation begins with the physical evidence. The ship herself, stranded on Diamond Shoals, is examined as carefully as the conditions allow. The Coast Guard and representatives from the various agencies go over her hull, her deck, her interior compartments, looking for anything that might illuminate what happened to her crew. Several things are noted beyond what the initial boarding party observed. The lifeboats are gone. This is significant. The Deering carried lifeboats, as all commercial vessels of her size were required to do, and those boats are not present. They were launched or cut loose or otherwise removed before the ship ran aground. This suggests that the crew or someone abandoned ship voluntarily or was removed from the ship in the boats. It suggests, at minimum, that there was time and deliberate effort involved in whatever happened, not a sudden catastrophe that swept everyone overboard in an instant. This is both reassuring and troubling, in the way that evidence often is. It means the crew was probably alive when they left the ship. It means they probably had some agency in their departure, but it does not explain where they went, or whether they survived, or what drove them to leave. The anchor chains, it is confirmed, were cut. Not frayed, not broken, not worn through by long use, but cut cleanly, in the manner of deliberate action. Whoever cut those chains had a reason to do so. The most obvious reason would be that the ship was in some danger and needed to be freed from her anchors quickly, that cutting was faster than releasing, that seconds mattered. This kind of emergency cut is not unheard of in maritime history. But it is also not the first thing a careful sailor does, because anchors are expensive and useful, and you do not cut away your anchor chains unless you have a very good reason. The missing anchors, combined with the message to the Cape Fear lightship about having lost both anchors, suggests that whatever happened to the anchors happened before the ship reached Diamond Shoals. The message was sent from near Cape Fear. The shoals are further north. The ship was already anchorless when she ran aground, which means she had no means of stopping herself when she found herself in the shallows. The navigation instruments. This remains the detail that the investigators find most difficult to explain through any ordinary chain of events. Compasses do not simply disappear from their mounts. Binnacles do not simply break without human agency. Someone removed the navigational equipment and damaged the compass housing, and there is no innocent explanation for why a crew would do this to their own ship. The steering gear damage is similarly puzzling. Disabling your own steering gear on a working vessel serves no obvious purpose except to make the ship impossible to control. If you are abandoning ship, you do not stop to disable the steering first. If you are in an emergency, you do not take time for sabotage. The deliberate nature of this damage suggests planning, suggests intention, suggests that whoever did it wanted the ship to be helpless. The investigators note all of this. They photograph the damage where they can. They collect samples of the materials found aboard. They take statements from the crew of the Coast Guard cutter, from the lightship men who spoke with someone from the Deering, from people in Barbados who saw the ship and her crew in their final known port of call. And then they begin interviewing families. The families of the 10 missing men are contacted. Their homes are visited by investigators who are trying to construct a picture of each crew member, to understand who these men were, what their histories suggested, whether any of them had enemies or reasons to disappear. This is painstaking work, and much of it yields nothing immediately useful. The crew of the Deering was, on the surface, a collection of ordinary working men, the kind of men who have always crewed the commercial vessels of the Atlantic coast. Men who knew the sea, who needed the work, who signed aboard for a specific voyage and expected to come home when it was done. McClellan's background is investigated with particular attention. He is the man Captain Wormel feared. He is the man who was observed making alarming statements in Barbados. The investigators want to know as much about him as they can, and what they find is the portrait of a man with a complicated history. He has sailed on numerous vessels, some of those experiences apparently uneventful, some of them marked by the same kind of friction that characterized his time on the Deering. He is not a man without experience. He is not a man without skill. He is a man whose temperament has apparently made him difficult to serve with on more than one occasion. What the investigators cannot find is any direct evidence of what McClellan did, if anything, aboard the Deering during her final days. He is missing, like everyone else. The sea has him, or something else does, and the sea and that something else are not talking. The State Department's involvement brings an interesting dimension to the investigation. The Deering's final voyage took her through Caribbean waters during a period of significant political tension. Prohibition has been in effect in the United States since 1920, and the rum-running trade, the illegal smuggling of alcohol from the Caribbean and elsewhere into the dry United States, is at this point already a thriving and profitable criminal enterprise. The coast of North Carolina, with its shallow sounds and its many inlets, is a particular target for rum runners, who know that the geography makes it difficult for the Coast Guard to intercept them effectively. Could the Carroll A. Deering have been involved in rum running? Could she have been targeted by someone in that trade? Could her crew have been removed by force by people who wanted the ship for their own purposes, or who simply wanted the crew silenced? This theory has a certain dark appeal, and it will persist in the investigation and in the popular retelling of the Deering story for many years. It will never be proven, but it points to something real, which is that in 1921, the waters off the Carolinas were not safe in the way that they appeared to be. There were people operating in those waters who were not bound by ordinary law, and they were not gentle. The investigation continues. Weeks pass, and then months. The paperwork accumulates. The witnesses are interviewed and re-interviewed. The physical evidence is analysed and reanalyzed. And the 5 government agencies, despite their collective resources and authority, cannot answer the simple and devastating question at the centre of this case. What happened to the crew of the Carroll A. Deering? The question floats on the surface of the story like a vessel with no one at the helm, drifting on the current, going where the water takes it, arriving finally at a place where no one expected and no one can quite explain. Rest in that quiet for a moment. The investigators are still working, somewhere in the past, turning over the pieces of a puzzle that will never be completed. Let their work continue without your supervision. The answer, if there is one, is already there, already fixed in the past, in the specific reality of what happened on a cold January sea a century ago. You do not need to find it tonight. Tonight, you only need to rest. To understand the Carroll A. Deering, you need to understand Diamond Shoals. You need to understand what kind of place this is, what the coast of North Carolina is and has always been, why ships come to grief here in a way that they do nowhere else along the eastern seaboard of North America. The outer banks of North Carolina are a thin chain of barrier islands, sand spits and dunes and narrow strips of land strung along the coast like a bead necklace, separated from the mainland by the shallow sounds that lie behind them. They are beautiful, in the austere way that bare sandy landscapes are beautiful, the way the marsh grass bends in the wind, and the pelicans ride the air currents, and the light comes off the water in the late afternoon, with a particular golden quality that painters have been trying to capture for as long as painters have come here. But they are dangerous. They are dangerous in the way that beautiful things sometimes are, in the way that a coastline can be gorgeous and lethal at the same time, the shallow water hiding the sandy bottom that is death to a vessel of any significant draught. Diamond Shoals extends more than 10 miles out from Cape Hatteras, a ridge of sand just below the surface, invisible until it is too late, a trap for ships that come too close to shore. The currents here are extraordinary. The Gulf Stream, flowing northward from the tropics, meets the cold Labrador current flowing south from the Arctic, and they collide in these waters in a way that creates unpredictable eddies and rips and confused seas. The weather comes fast off the Atlantic, storms materializing from open water with a speed that can catch an experienced sailor off guard. The wind shifts without warning. The fog comes in thick and grey and swallows the world. And beneath it all, always, the shoals. They called it the graveyard of the Atlantic. That name was not hyperbole. More than 1,000 ships have been lost in these waters over the centuries, from the earliest European explorers to the submarine victims of World War II, when German U-boats patrolled these sea lanes and sent dozens of Allied vessels to the bottom within sight of the American shore. The sand beneath the sea here is layered with the bones of ships, the rusted iron of anchors and chains, the dissolved wood of hulls that were once stout and watertight, the personal effects of sailors who found this stretch of coast at the wrong moment. The Coast Guard station at Cape Hatteras exists because of this record. The surfmen who patrol these beaches, who man the lookout towers and launch the rescue boats, are there specifically because this is the kind of place where ships come to grief. They are men who know the sea in its worst moods, who have learned to read the weather and the water the way other men read books, who carry in their bodies the accumulated knowledge of what this coast can do. See. Oh, Brady, the surfman who spotted the Deering on January 31, was doing what surfmen do, walking the beach, watching the water, looking for ships in trouble. He had almost certainly seen ships in distress before. He had probably helped rescue sailors from vessels driven onto the shoals. He knew what a ship in trouble looked like, and he knew what the Deering looked like. And the fact that he immediately understood something was wrong tells you something about the particular nature of the wrongness he was observing. A ship without a crew looks different from a ship with one, even at a distance. Even when you cannot see the details, cannot count the people on deck or identify the captain at the wheel. There is something in the way an unmanned vessel moves on the water, something in the way it sits, something in the absence of the small constant adjustments that a crewed vessel makes, that communicates its emptiness to anyone practiced enough to see it. Brady saw it. He knew. He sent his report and watched and waited, and for 2 days the Deering sat on Diamond Shoals, her hull settling into the sand, the sea moving around her, and no one able to reach her because the weather was too rough and the shoal water too shallow for the rescue boats. 2 days. Think about what those 2 days must have been like for the Coast Guard men watching from shore. Knowing there was something wrong. Knowing they could not get to it. Watching the ship and the sea and the sky and waiting for the weather to relent enough to allow them across the shoal. The weather is always the governing force here. It is the thing that everything else must work around or wait for. Sailors on these waters have always understood that the sea grants permission, and the sea withdraws permission, and the sea's schedule is the only schedule that matters in the end. You can plan all you like. You can have the best equipment and the most experienced crew and the most favourable passage record in the fleet. And then the weather changes, and you wait. Or you suffer the consequences of not waiting. When the rescue cutter finally reached the Deering on February 1, the weather had calmed to the point where they could make the approach, but the shoal was still a challenge. The water is shallow over Diamond Shoals, shallow enough in places to stand upright, shallow enough that larger vessels have to approach carefully or risk grounding themselves in the attempt to reach a grounded ship. The Coast Guard men knew these waters, and they came in as close as they dared before the boarding party made its way across to the Deering. The ship had been on the shoal for at least 2 days by then, long enough for the sand to have worked its way around the hull, long enough for the stress of grounding to have begun its slow damage to the structure. Ships that go aground on sandy shoals are not always destroyed immediately. If the sand is soft enough and the sea calm enough, a grounded vessel can sit for days or weeks before the damage becomes critical. Diamond Shoals, in winter, can be merciful that way, though they are just as often not. The investigators who come later to examine the Deering will note that the grounding itself does not appear to have been the catastrophe it might have been. The hull is not breached. The ship is not taking on water in the critical way. She is stranded, not sinking. And with the proper equipment, it would in theory be possible to refloat her, to repair the damage to her steering and navigation, to get her off the shoal and back to a port where the investigation could continue. That is eventually what happens. The Deering is eventually refloated and examined more thoroughly, but by the time the investigators have finished with her, she is beyond economical repair, and she is towed out to sea and scuttled. The ship that was the scene of whatever happened ends her days beneath the Atlantic, the mystery of what occurred on her deck sealed inside her with the cold water as she goes down. There is something appropriate about that, and something sad. The ship knows, in whatever sense a ship can be said to know anything. The wood of her hull was present, the iron of her fittings was present, the coal in her galley stove was present when whatever happened happened, and the warmth of that coal was the warmth the Coast Guard found when they boarded, the last trace of the crew in the form of a meal that was never eaten. Now the sea has her. She has joined the 1,000 other ships at the bottom of the graveyard of the Atlantic, and the fish move through her hold, and the sand shifts around her ribs, and the sea does not care what she knew or what she saw or what her surfaces recorded in the final hours of her life as a working vessel. The sea never tells its stories, it only keeps them. The lighthouses that stand along this coast were built specifically to prevent what happens here anyway. Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, the tallest brick lighthouse in North America, was erected in 1870, precisely because Diamond Shoals had claimed so many ships that the coast itself had earned its graveyard name before any official body thought to mark the danger with light. The lighthouse beam reaches 18 miles out to sea on a clear night, a sweeping pulse of illumination that says, in its patient way, turn away from here. The shoals are closer than you think, and still ships have come to grief. Because the lighthouse can tell you where the danger is, but it cannot control the weather that drives a vessel toward the shore against her captain's wishes, cannot silence the storm that pushes a ship onto the sand, despite every effort of every experienced hand aboard. The light warns, the sea decides. In the winter of 1921, there was no radio direction finding in widespread use for small commercial vessels. There was no satellite navigation, no electronic chart, no automated alert system. There was the compass and the sextant, and the lighthouse beam, and the navigator's accumulated knowledge of these waters. There was the dead reckoning that experienced sailors used to track their position when the sky was overcast and the stars hidden, the calculation, of course, and speed, and elapsed time that could place a ship's position on a chart with reasonable accuracy, or with catastrophic inaccuracy, depending on how many assumptions had accumulated unexamined. The Deering had navigational instruments when she left Barbados. She did not have them when the Coast Guard boarded her off Diamond Shoals. The compasses were gone. The navigation charts that should have been in the chart house were either missing or in disarray. This detail matters because it changes the nature of the question. A ship without navigational instruments is a ship that cannot know with certainty where she is. Whether the instruments were removed deliberately, whether they disappeared in the same event that removed the crew, or whether there is some other explanation that the investigation never surfaced, is one of the smaller mysteries nested inside the larger one. Consider what it means for a ship to lose her navigational instruments on a coast like this one. Diamond Shoals does not announce itself. It does not feel different from open water until the hull is already touching the sand. A ship approaching from the south, moving up the coast in January, would need to know her position relative to Cape Hatteras to make a safe offing around the shoals. Without instruments, without certainty about where she was, the margin for error shrinks to nothing. Perhaps the Deering ran onto the shoal because no one was steering her. Perhaps she ran onto the shoal because no one was navigating her. Perhaps she ran onto the shoal for reasons that had nothing to do with the loss of her crew and everything to do with the particular hazards of this stretch of coast in the particular conditions of that January night. Ships have run onto Diamond Shoals with full crews aboard and experienced captains at the helm. It is that kind of place. Let that be a comfort of sorts, in the way that large and silent things can be a comfort. The ocean contains everything, every ship that has ever gone down, every voice that has ever called across the water, every meal that has been cooked and served and eaten on a swaying deck, and every meal that has been cooked and left waiting and eventually gone cold. The sea holds all of it, in the deep cold and the dark, as permanent as anything in this world gets to be. The investigators on shore continue their work. The papers multiply. The theories accumulate. And Diamond Shoals sits off the cape in the winter sea, unchanged, as patient as sand, as old as the shore, keeping its secrets the way it has always kept them. In April of 1921, roughly 3 months after the Deering was found on Diamond Shoals, a man named Christopher Columbus Gray was walking the beach on Buxton, North Carolina, which is on the Outer Banks not far from Cape Hatteras. It was the kind of morning that the banks produce in April, cool but brightening, the wind off the sea carrying the smell of salt and the season's first warmth, the light clear and the beach relatively empty. Gray found a bottle. Inside the bottle was a note. The note read, in its essential contents, as follows: something to the effect that the crew of the Deering had been captured by an unknown vessel, and that whoever found this message should notify the authorities. The note gave some details. It mentioned the names of the ships involved. It was written in what appeared to be a hurried hand. This is, on its surface, an extraordinary discovery. A message in a bottle found on the very coast closest to where the Deering had been found. A message purportedly from a crew member, describing what happened. The note, if authentic, would resolve the central mystery of the case in a single stroke. The crew had been taken by pirates, or by whatever passed for pirates in the modern Atlantic, criminals on a vessel of some kind who had intercepted the Deering and removed her crew by force. Gray turned the note over to the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard forwarded it to the investigators, and the investigators, being thorough, began the process of determining whether the note was genuine. It was not. Or at least, that is what the investigation concluded. The analysis of the note, the paper on which it was written, the ink, the handwriting, the specific details of what it claimed, all of this pointed in the same direction. The note was a forgery, or at least not what it claimed to be. It had not been in the sea long enough to account for the time since the Deering went missing. The details it contained were either wrong or suspiciously vague. The handwriting did not match any sample from the known crew members that the investigators were able to obtain for comparison. Gray himself was questioned extensively. He maintained that he had simply found the bottle on the beach, that he had not manufactured the note, that he had done his civic duty in reporting it. The investigation was unable to prove definitively that he had forged it, and the investigators, being careful, noted in their reports that they could not rule out the possibility that the note was genuine but simply degraded, or that the analysis was incomplete. But the working conclusion was that the bottle message was a hoax. This was, in its way, almost as interesting as if the note had been real. Someone had gone to the trouble of composing a message, putting it in a bottle, and either throwing it into the sea or placing it on the beach where it would be found. Someone had done this with the purpose of either contributing to the investigation, mischievously muddying it, or drawing attention to themselves in some way. The motive for hoaxing a message in a bottle relating to a maritime mystery is not immediately obvious, but human beings have always had a complicated relationship with famous puzzles, a desire to participate in them, to contribute to them, to become part of the story in some way. The bottle message remains one of the strange footnotes of the Deering case, not because it tells us what happened, but because it tells us something about how people respond to a mystery of this kind, how the absence of an explanation creates a space that people feel compelled to fill, even if they have to fill it themselves. There is something worth sitting with here, in the dark and the quiet, as you let the story move through you, the impulse to explain, the human need to take a mystery and give it a solution, any solution, rather than let it remain open and unresolved. It is a deeply understandable impulse. Mysteries are uncomfortable. They sit in the mind like a stone in a shoe, small and persistent, impossible to ignore. The temptation to simply remove the stone, even if you have to manufacture a removal, is real. But the Deering case resists that impulse. It has resisted it for 100 years. Every explanation that has been offered, and there have been many, has proven either unprovable or demonstrably wrong. The mystery persists because the evidence persists in being what it is, neither complete enough to solve nor sparse enough to dismiss. It is the most frustrating kind of puzzle, the kind where you can see most of the pieces but cannot make them fit. The bottle message was not the last piece of evidence that would surface in the months and years following the Deering's grounding. Other fragments would emerge, other witnesses would come forward, other details would be added to the record. But the bottle message has a particular resonance because it is so explicitly a response to the mystery itself, someone reaching into the gap that the Deering left and trying to fill it with something, even something fictional. What did the real message say, if there was one? What would a crew member have written, in those final hours or days, if he had the time and the presence of mind to write it? Would he have explained clearly what was happening? Would he have had enough information to explain? Sometimes the people at the center of a crisis are the least able to articulate what the crisis is, because they are inside it, surrounded by it, without the distance that understanding requires. Maybe he would have written simply, "The ship is taken," or "We are leaving," or "God help us." Or maybe he would have written nothing at all, because there was no time, or because there was nothing to write with, or because whatever happened too fast for a message to be composed and sealed and thrown into the sea. The real message, if there was one, is at the bottom of the Atlantic. Along with everything else the Deering knew, the fake bottle washes up on the beach. Gray carries it home. The investigators examine it and set it aside. The mystery continues. Later that same year, another small and strange piece of evidence will surface. A pump, believed to be from the Deering's lifeboat, will be found on the beach. This is consistent with the lifeboats having been launched, consistent with the crew having left the ship in the boats, but it tells investigators nothing about where the boats went, whether they made it to shore, whether the men in them survived. A pump is a thing that can drift a long way on Atlantic currents. A pump is not a witness. The months pass. The investigation loses momentum the way all investigations eventually do, when the witnesses have been re-interviewed too many times to produce new information and the evidence has been examined until it yields nothing more. The 5 agencies withdraw their active involvement, leaving the file open in the formal sense but no longer actively pursuing it. The Deering case becomes what it will remain for the next century. An open file, a famous mystery, a story that people tell in books and articles and now in videos, wondering and arriving always at the same place, which is not an answer but only the question itself, clean and unresolved as the winter sea. Prohibition began on the 17th of January, 1920. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States and the Volstead Act that gave it teeth made the manufacture, transport, and sale of alcohol illegal across the nation. What followed was one of the most consequential and ultimately unsuccessful legal experiments in American history, a 13-year attempt to regulate the drinking habits of a country that did not wish to be regulated in that particular way. What Prohibition produced, along with the speakeasies and the gangsters and the federal agents with their axes and their warrant papers, was an enormous and immediately profitable smuggling trade. Alcohol from the Caribbean, from Canada, from anywhere outside the reach of American law, began flowing into the country through whatever routes were available. The sea was the most practical route for large quantities, and the coast of North Carolina, with its maze of sounds and inlets, its shallow water and its long stretches of deserted beach, was one of the most practical stretches of sea. By 1921, Rum-Running, as it came to be called, was already a serious and well-organized criminal enterprise along the Atlantic coast. Vessels of various sizes, from small fast motorboats to converted fishing vessels to actual cargo schooners, were being used to move contraband alcohol from offshore sources to onshore distributors. The Coast Guard was outmanned and outrun. The waters were vast, and the enforcement resources were limited, and the profit margins on illegal alcohol were high enough to justify the risk. The Carroll A. Deering had been on a voyage that took her through the Caribbean. She was a large commercial schooner with substantial cargo capacity. She was operating in waters where rum-running operations were active. She disappeared in a location that was a known corridor for illegal alcohol shipments. These facts, taken together, suggest a question that the investigators certainly asked. Could the Deering have been involved in rum-running? And if so, could her disappearance be related to that involvement? There are several versions of this theory, and they are not all consistent with each other, which is itself suggestive of the difficulty of pinning down what might have happened. The most straightforward version posits that the Deering was chartered or commandeered, possibly without the knowledge of the ship's owners, to carry illegal alcohol from the Caribbean to the North Carolina coast. When the transaction went wrong, either through violence or through the involvement of rival criminal operations or through an attempt to cheat the rum runners, the crew was killed or otherwise eliminated, and the ship was stripped of whatever it was carrying before being abandoned. A more complicated version suggests that the crew themselves, or some members of the crew, were knowingly involved in rum-running, and that this involvement led to the conflict that evidently existed on board, that the tension between Warmel and McClellan had something to do with a disagreement about illegal activities rather than simply a clash of personalities. A third version, darker still, suggests that the ship was taken not by rum-runners, but by someone who wanted to silence the crew for reasons that had nothing to do with alcohol, and that the rum-running connection was either incidental or a deliberate misdirection. None of these versions can be proven. But the rum-running theory has persisted for a century because it has what the other theories sometimes lack, a coherent motive. In the early 1920s, people were killing each other over illegal alcohol on a regular basis. The violence of organized crime in the Prohibition era is well documented. The notion that a ship's crew could be murdered or taken by force by someone in the rum trade is not fantastical. It is entirely consistent with what was happening along the eastern seaboard at the time. The State Department investigators were particularly interested in this angle. They spent considerable time and resources looking into whether the Deering or any member of her crew had connections to the rum trade. What they found was inconclusive. There was no direct evidence that the ship had been used for smuggling. There was no evidence that any crew member was known to be involved in criminal activities. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly in a criminal enterprise designed to leave no evidence. What the investigators did find was that the waters off the Carolinas in January 1921 were not empty waters. There were other vessels in those sea lanes. There were vessels whose business was not entirely transparent, and there was a specific report, later looked into and found impossible to verify, of a vessel of suspicious character having been seen in the vicinity of where the Deering went missing. This unverified report adds a layer to the Rum-Runner theory that is tantalizing in the way that all tantalizing things are. It fits, almost perfectly, with what the physical evidence suggests, and it cannot be confirmed. The cut anchor chains, the disabled steering, the missing crew, the meal abandoned mid-preparation, all of these details are consistent with a forcible boarding and crew removal. They are consistent with a crew that had time to signal for help at Cape Fear, but was taken before they could make landfall. They are consistent with a professional criminal operation that knew what it was doing, but consistent with is not the same as evidence of. The Rum-Runner theory, like every theory in the Deering case, eventually arrives at the same wall. The evidence that would confirm it is at the bottom of the sea, along with the crew, along with whatever cargo may or may not have been aboard, along with the truth of what the first mate threatened in Barbados, and what the captain feared, and what the cook was preparing when whatever happened happened. There is also the question of why a rum-running operation would want a large commercial schooner. The preference in the rum trade was generally for speed, for small, fast vessels that could outrun the Coast Guard, not for large, slow cargo ships that were easily identified. The Deering, at nearly 200 feet long and clearly marked, was not the sort of vessel that would disappear quietly into the criminal maritime economy without being noticed. Using her for smuggling would require either a very good hiding place or a very quick turnaround. Unless the plan was simply to remove the crew and sink the ship, leaving no witnesses and no evidence. That thought is a cold one, and it does not need to be dwelt upon. Let it pass through and away like a cloud moving across a winter sky. The people aboard the Deering were working men, sailors, doing a job they knew how to do, sailing a ship they were responsible for, going home. Whatever happened to them, they did not deserve it. That much can be said with certainty, whatever the details of the rest. The Rum-Runner theory has had its adherents over the decades, and it continues to be raised in discussions of the case. It is the most worldly of the theories, the most anchored in the historical reality of what the eastern seaboard of the United States was like in 1921, the most consistent with the documented reality of criminal violence in that time and place. But the sea off Cape Hatteras has not confirmed it. The sea off Cape Hatteras does not confirm anything. It only accepts, and holds, and keeps. Somewhere under the grey Atlantic water, the truth of what happened to the Carroll A, Deering lies preserved in the cold and the dark, beyond the reach of any investigation, beyond the reach of any explanation offered on dry land. The rum-runners, if rum-runners were involved, are long dead. The crew, whatever became of them, are long gone. The ship herself is at the bottom of the sea, where the official records placed her when she could no longer be economically repaired. And the mystery persists, as clean and unresolved as it was on the morning of the 1st of February 1921, when a Coast Guard boarding party climbed onto an empty ship and found dinner waiting on the stove. You are halfway through this story now, or perhaps beyond it. If you are still listening, resting in the warmth and the quiet, that is good. The Deering's mystery keeps its shape in the dark, patient as the sea that holds it. If you find these stories worth returning to, subscribe. There will always be another ship, another coast, another silence waiting on the other side of sleep. The word had been spoken in Barbados, not whispered, but said aloud, in a portside establishment with enough witnesses that multiple people later reported it to investigators. McClellan had said something about the captain, something about putting him in irons. Something that, in the context of the relationship between the first mate and the captain, as it was understood by those who knew them, sounded very much like a threat. Mutiny. The oldest crime of the sea. To understand what mutiny means on a sailing vessel of the early 20th century, you need to understand what authority means on such a vessel. The captain of a commercial ship is not merely a manager or a supervisor. He is, within the boundaries of his vessel, something closer to the absolute authority of an earlier age of seafaring. The law gives him enormous power over the people who sail under him. He can confine crew members who disobey. He can make log entries that affect a sailor's career and reputation. He can, in serious cases, make arrests. The hierarchy of a working ship is rigid, and for good reason, because at sea, confusion of authority is not merely an organizational problem. It is a threat to survival. A first mate who challenges the captain's authority is not simply being difficult. He is attacking the structure that holds the ship together. He is, in the maritime tradition, doing something that every sailor understands to be serious, to be dangerous, to be the kind of thing that cannot be allowed to develop unchecked without consequences for everyone aboard. Captain Wormel understood this. That is why he went to the American consul in Barbados. That is why he confided his fears. He was not simply complaining about a difficult employee. He was describing a situation that he recognized as potentially threatening to the safety of his ship and his crew. The mutiny theory, as it has been developed over the decades since the Deering disappeared, runs roughly as follows. McClellan, perhaps encouraged by drink, perhaps having cultivated allies among the discontented crew, perhaps simply having reached a breaking point in his own turbulent relationship with authority, moved against Captain Wormel after the ship left Barbados. The exact form this took is unknown, but the theory suggests that Wormel was either killed or incapacitated, that McClellan or others loyal to him took command of the ship, and that the subsequent behaviour of the vessel, the cut anchor chains, the disabled steering, the message about lost anchors, reflected the actions of a crew that had mutinied and was now trying to cover its tracks. Under this theory, the crew left the ship voluntarily, either knowing that the Deering would be found and fearing the investigation that would follow, or as part of some prearranged plan to disappear and begin new lives elsewhere. The lifeboats were launched. The crew rowed to some waiting vessel, or to shore, or dispersed to different destinations. The empty ship was left to drift onto the shoals. The meal on the stove, under this theory, was either abandoned in the haste of departure or left deliberately, perhaps as a kind of message, perhaps simply because there was no time to remove it. This theory has the virtue of internal consistency. It explains the physical evidence in a coherent way. The disabled steering and cut anchors make sense if the goal was to ensure the ship could not be easily followed or recovered. The missing navigation instruments make sense if someone was removing evidence of where the ship had been. The abandoned meal makes sense if the departure was hurried or emotionally charged in the way that a mutiny's aftermath might be. But the mutiny theory has problems too. The first and most significant problem is, where did everyone go? If the crew mutinied and then abandoned ship in the lifeboats, they had to go somewhere. North Carolina in 1921 was not a wilderness. There were people on the Outer Banks. There were towns and settlements along the coast. If 10 men came ashore from lifeboats in January 1921, someone would have noticed. Someone would have talked. Sailors in a group are conspicuous. 10 men arriving unexpectedly on a cold January beach would be remembered. No such memory has ever been reliably documented. The Coast Guard searched the beaches and the sounds after the Deering was found. No lifeboats from the Deering were located with crew members in them. No crew members were found ashore. No one in the coastal communities reported seeing anything unusual. It is possible that the crew made it to another vessel rather than to shore. It is possible that they were picked up by a ship that took them to some other destination, that they dispersed from there, that the conspiracy of silence held. But this requires a level of coordination and complicity that is difficult to maintain. 10 men keeping a secret, especially a secret as dramatic as a shipboard mutiny and crew disappearance, is a tall order. People talk. People write letters. People get drunk and say things. The absence of any whisper, any rumour, any deathbed confession, over the 100 years since the Deering disappeared, is itself a piece of evidence, though an ambiguous one. The other problem with the mutiny theory is the nature of the missing. If McClellan and his allies mutinied against Wormel, what happened to Wormel, and to Bates the cook, and to the other crew members who might not have been part of the mutiny? If the crew split along factional lines, some for McClellan and some loyal to the captain, the aftermath could have been violent. But there is no evidence of violence aboard the Deering. No bloodstains were reported by the boarding party. No signs of struggle. An absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is a constraint on what the evidence can support. Perhaps the mutiny theory works best if we imagine it as bloodless, as a confrontation that ended not in violence but in some kind of forced surrender, with Wormel either agreeing to leave the ship peacefully or being confined and then released when the crew abandoned ship. This is possible. It is the kind of maritime drama that the historical record can support in theory, if not in specifics. But it remains a theory, and theories, in the absence of bodies or witnesses or confessions or any of the other forms of evidence that move a case from the theoretical to the factual, remain exactly what they are. McClellan's name is the name that appears most often in discussions of the mutiny theory. He had the motive, or at least the established pattern of behavior that could provide a motive. He had the temperament. He had apparently made the threats. But McClellan is as missing as everyone else on the Deering. He did not surface after the ship was found. He did not leave a confession or a letter or a deathbed statement. He simply vanished into the same Atlantic that took the rest of the crew, and whatever he knew about what happened on the Deering, he kept. The theory lives on, as theories do, sustained by the coherence of the narrative it offers and the absence of a better one. It is possible, it might even be probable in the actuarial sense that among all the possible explanations, it is one of the more likely. But probability is not certainty, and certainty is what the families of the Deering's crew were owed and never received. Let the mutiny theory settle into the quiet with you. 10 men and a ship and a conflict that had been building since Barbados, maybe longer. A night or a day somewhere between Cape Fear and Diamond Shoals. A decision, or a confrontation, or a catastrophe, and then the empty ship, and the warm stove, and the silence. Whatever happened, it happened. It is done. The people it happened to are as far from any harm as anyone can be, resting in whatever rest the sea provides for those it keeps. There is nothing more to fear in this story. Only the quiet of a winter ocean, the sound of water against wood, and the long, slow settling of a mystery that has made its peace with being unsolved. In 1974, a writer named Charles Berlitz published a book called The Bermuda Triangle. It was a bestseller. It proposed that a roughly triangular section of the Atlantic Ocean, bounded by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, was the site of an unusual number of maritime and aviation disappearances, and that these disappearances might have supernatural or paranormal explanations. The Carroll A. Deering appeared in the book. She appeared in many books about the Bermuda Triangle, in many magazine articles, in many television documentaries about mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena. She became part of a genre, part of a tradition of storytelling that had more to do with the human desire for mystery than with the specific factual record of what was and was not known about particular cases. It is worth spending a little time with this, not to dismiss it, but to understand what it says about the Deering case and about mysteries in general. The Bermuda Triangle theory, as applied to the Deering, posits that the ship disappeared in or near a region of the ocean where something unusual happens, where ships and planes vanish without explanation, where the ordinary laws of navigation and reason do not quite apply. The theory does not specify what the unusual thing is, which is part of its appeal. It is an explanation that explains nothing while providing the feeling of explanation. Something mysterious happened in a mysterious place. This is, in a sense, true of most things, but it is not particularly useful. The actual route of the Carroll A. Deering, when traced carefully on a chart, puts her disappearance off the coast of North Carolina, north of the area traditionally associated with the Bermuda Triangle. She was not in the Triangle. She was in the waters of the American eastern seaboard, in a specific and historically documented stretch of dangerous coast. The graveyard of the Atlantic earned its name through natural processes, through geography and weather and the physics of shallow water and strong currents, not through any supernatural interference. And yet the Bermuda Triangle Association persists in popular discussions of the Deering case, and it is worth asking why. The answer, perhaps, is that the Deering case genuinely does resist ordinary explanation, not because something supernatural occurred, but because the evidence that would support an ordinary explanation has not survived. The result is the same, a mystery. The mechanism is different, not the supernatural, but the ordinary impermanence of evidence at sea. Ships disappear, crews die. The ocean is large and cold, and it does not keep records in a format that human beings can read. When a ship goes down quickly, or when a crew is lost at sea, there are usually no witnesses, no surviving documents, no forensic evidence of the kind that land-based investigations rely on. The sea absorbs the evidence along with everything else. What made the Deering unusual was not that she disappeared, but that she was found. She was found with enough evidence remaining to demonstrate clearly that something unusual had happened, but not enough evidence to explain what. This is the particular frustration of the case. More evidence than a simple disappearance, not enough evidence for an explanation. The Bermuda Triangle provided a container for that frustration, a name and a geography for the feeling of something inexplicable. It was not good science, and it was not good investigation, but it was a human response to a genuine mystery, and human responses to genuine mysteries are worth understanding even when the response itself is not entirely accurate. There have been other paranormal and exotic theories proposed for the Deering. Some have suggested that the crew encountered a waterspout or some other extreme weather phenomenon that swept them off the deck without damaging the ship. Some have suggested rogue waves, the kind of sudden, enormous waves that can appear with little warning in certain ocean conditions and that are capable of clearing a ship's deck in an instant. Some have even suggested, in the decades since the case first became famous, the involvement of UFOs or other phenomena that do not belong to the vocabulary of ordinary maritime investigation. These theories share a quality with the Bermuda Triangle theory. They explain the physical evidence in a way that avoids any need for human agency. No criminal, no mutineer, no rum-runner. Just an impersonal force, a natural or supernatural phenomenon that swept 10 men away without leaving a trace and without offering any survivors to tell the tale. The rogue wave theory in particular has received some serious consideration. Rogue waves are real. They have been documented by scientific instruments and by the accounts of survivors who have experienced them. They can reach heights of 30 meters or more, appearing suddenly from what seemed like normal sea conditions. A rogue wave of sufficient size could, in theory, sweep a ship's deck clean of everyone on it in seconds, without capsizing the ship, without leaving the kind of damage that a storm or a grounding would leave. This theory has the virtue of explaining the abandonment of the dinner table, the suddenness of the crew's departure, the absence of any sign of preparation for leaving. A rogue wave does not give warning. It does not allow for packing bags or writing messages. It comes and takes and recedes, and whatever it took is gone. But the rogue wave theory has its own problems. The ship was found on a shoal, not adrift in deep water. If a rogue wave had hit her while she was well offshore, the wave would most likely have also affected her course and sails in ways that the evidence does not support. And the cut anchor chains, the disabled steering, the missing navigation instruments, none of these can be explained by a rogue wave. These are deliberate acts. They require human hands. A rogue wave does not cut anchor chains. Every theory that removes human agency from the Deering case eventually runs into the physical evidence which insists on human agency. Someone cut those chains. Someone disabled that steering gear. Someone removed those compasses. Whatever else happened aboard the Deering, people did these things. People with hands and tools and purposes, and those people are gone. The intersection of the human and the inexplicable is where the Deering case lives. It is not a ghost story, though it has the quality of one. It is not a supernatural mystery, though it has attracted those who believe in supernatural mysteries. It is a human story, a story of people in a specific historical moment with specific relationships and specific fears, caught up in something that ended badly and left very little explanation behind. That is the most honest thing that can be said about the Carroll A. Deering case. It is a human story with a human tragedy at its centre, and the tragedy is not the loss of an abstract crew, but the loss of 10 specific men, Willis Wormel and Charles McClellan and Herbert Bates, and the 7 others whose names are in the record, whose families waited for them and received news they did not want, and then received no more news at all, only the open question that remained after the investigators closed their files. Rest in that humanity for a moment. The names: 10 men, real lives, real histories, real people who had mornings before this one and were looking forward to mornings after it. The sea does not distinguish between the famous and the forgotten, between the explained and the mysterious. It takes what it takes, and it keeps what it keeps, and the rest is the story we tell about it afterward. Whatever the truth of the Bermuda Triangle, whatever the truth of rogue waves and rum runners and mutinies, the truth of the Deering is that 10 people are gone. That is not mysterious. That is simply irreducibly sad. Before this story closes around the mystery and lets it settle into the dark where it has always lived, it is worth stepping back from the investigation and the theories and spending some time with what the life of the Deering's crew actually looked like. What did it mean to be a sailor on a commercial schooner in 1921? What were the days like? What did these men carry in their minds and in their hands as they went about the work of sailing a large wooden ship from one port to another? The work was hard. Not hard in the dramatic, romantic way that sea stories sometimes make it sound. Not necessarily hard in the way of storms and crisis and desperate struggle, but hard in the basic physical sense of work that never stops, that demands the body consistently and completely, that makes no allowance for days when you would rather rest. A commercial sailing vessel of this size required constant attention. The sails needed to be trimmed whenever the wind changed, which on the Atlantic was often. The rigging needed inspection, because rigging is complex and it fails in ways that range from inconvenient to catastrophic, and a careful crew notices small problems before they become large ones. The hull needed to be monitored for any sign of the taking on water that is, for a wooden ship, the thing you most fear and most vigilantly prevent. The decks needed to be kept clear of lines and tackle and the accumulated debris of daily life at sea, because a tripping hazard on a deck that is moving with the swell is a hazard of the kind that sends men overboard. The watch system meant that no sailor got a full night's sleep during a voyage. Watches typically rotated in 4-hour intervals, 2 watches sharing the 24 hours of a day, with each man standing his watch and then sleeping when he could. The body adapts to this schedule, up to a point, but it never quite accepts it. The interrupted sleep of a sailor on a long voyage is one of the things that makes everything else harder, that makes the work more grinding, the conflicts more volatile, the judgment more suspect than it might otherwise be. The food on a sailing vessel was not the same as the food on shore, and sailors understood this before they signed on, but understanding it and living it are different things. The cook did what he could with what he had, which was mostly preserved goods and whatever fresh provisions had been loaded in the last port. Salt beef and salt pork, hard bread, dried beans, occasionally fresh fish if someone had luck trolling a line off the stern. Fresh water was carefully rationed. Coffee was a luxury. The diet was sufficient for the work, mostly, but it was not varied, and it was not particularly pleasant, and the cook who could make it palatable was worth his wages 10 times over. Herbert Bates, the Deering's cook, was by the accounts available to us a competent man who did his job without extraordinary complaint or extraordinary praise. He is a peripheral figure in most accounts of the Deering story, the man whose meal became the symbol of the mystery, the warm stove and the uneaten food, but he was a person before he was a symbol. He had presumably cooked hundreds or thousands of meals at sea before the one that would become famous for not being eaten. He had presumably learned his way around a ship's galley over years of working on vessels not unlike the Deering, learned how to manage a coal stove that moved with the ship, how to produce something edible under conditions that would challenge a kitchen chef on dry land, how to feed 10 men 3 times a day without complaint and without running out of anything critical. What was he making on that last day? The accounts are not specific about the contents of the meal. They note only that a pot was on the stove, that it was warm, that the preparations suggested a meal in progress or recently completed. It might have been the same salt beef stew that had appeared at a dozen previous meal times on this voyage. It might have been something improvised from the dwindling stores as the ship came near the end of her run home. It was, in either case, an ordinary thing. The most ordinary thing in the world. A man doing his job, making food for people who depended on him. The other crew members are similarly individual, similarly human, similarly present in the record only as names and a few sparse facts. There was the second mate. There were the deckhands. There were the men who handled the specific technical aspects of sailing, the deering, the rigging, the anchors, the steering. Each of them had come to this work through some history, some sequence of decisions and circumstances that brought them to the Portland, Maine, shipping labour pool in the summer of 1920, that made them available when the Deering was looking for a crew, that put them aboard this particular ship on this particular voyage. Sailors in 1921 were not for the most part romantics. They were working men who had learned a trade that happened to involve the sea. The romance of the sea, which has always attracted a certain literary sensibility, coexisted with the reality of the sea, which was that it was cold and hard and indifferent, and would kill you if you gave it the opportunity. Men who worked the sea knew this. They were not deceived about it. They went back anyway, because the sea was where the work was, and because the sea, for those who know it, has a way of becoming the medium in which you think most clearly, the environment that fits you better than the crowded land. Captain Wormel had spent most of his life on the water, 66 years old, not in good health, troubled by his mate, sailing a ship he had not originally planned to command on a voyage that was taking longer than expected to resolve itself. He was, in his way, typical of the men who commanded the commercial schooners of that era. Men who had come up through the ranks of maritime work, who had learned the sea through decades of experience, who carried in their bodies and their instincts the knowledge of what the ocean could do and what a ship needed to keep it safe. His fear of McClellan was real. The consul in Barbados noted it. The acquaintance in Rio noted something similar. Warmell was a man who had managed difficult situations before, who had decades of maritime command experience, and something about McClellan frightened him in a way that those situations had not. What specifically frightened him, whether it was a direct threat or a pattern of behaviour or something intuited rather than explicitly stated, is not in the record. But the fear was there, and the ship sailed north, and the fear went with it, and whatever happened, happened, somewhere in the cold January Atlantic between the Caribbean warmth they were leaving and the wintry North Carolina coast they were approaching. Think of the night watches, the man at the helm in the cold dark, the wheel under his hands, the compass before him, the sound of the wind in the rigging, and the water against the hull. The stars visible when the sky was clear, absent when the clouds came in, the familiar constellations of the northern hemisphere slowly returning as the ship moved toward home. The phosphorescence in the ship's wake on certain nights, the cold ocean glowing green and white where the hull disturbed it, one of the genuine beauties of sailing at sea that no description quite captures. Think of the morning, the grey light coming up over the water, the cook beginning to work in the galley below, the smell of coffee, if there was coffee, the changing of the watch, the brief social moment of men going off duty and men coming on, the murmured reports of the night's progress, the heading, the weather, anything of note. Think of the days passing, the coast of South America falling behind, the Caribbean opening up, the endless blue water of the tropics giving way gradually to the greyer, cooler Atlantic. As the ship moved north, the temperature dropping, the clothing getting heavier, the smell of the air changing from the particular warmth of the south to the sharper, cleaner cold of the northern Atlantic in January, and then the Cape Fear lightship, and the message about the anchors, and the ship moving on, and then Diamond Shoals, and then the silence. The silence of the sea at night is not a simple silence. It is a layered silence, full of sounds that are not quite silence but that serve the same function, that create the same quality of apartness from the busy world of voices and machines and human urgency. The water moves against the hull with a sound like breathing, slow and rhythmic, responsive to the swell that passes under the ship with the patience of something that has been moving for longer than there have been ships to move beneath. The wind in the rigging makes a sound that sailors have described in 100 different ways, none of them quite adequate, a kind of harmonic vibration that changes with the wind's speed and direction, that can rise to a howl in a storm and subside to the barest whisper in a calm, that is always present as long as the ship is under sail. The men of the Deering would have known this silence, would have grown accustomed to it over the weeks of the voyage, the way you grow accustomed to any surrounding that envelops you completely enough and for long enough. The silence of the sea, after a while, stops being the absence of the sounds of shore and becomes simply the sound of the place you are, the ambient medium of a life lived offshore. There is something about the human capacity to adapt to conditions that feels almost miraculous, looked at from the outside. These men, pulled from the port cities of the American Northeast, from the streets and boarding houses and waterfront bars of Portland and Boston and New York, adjusted themselves to the rhythm of the sea within days of departure. The body adapts, the sleep schedule shifts, the appetite changes. The senses recalibrate to read wind and weather instead of traffic and crowd noise. The mind settles into the narrower and in some ways simpler world of the ship, where the demands are physical and the problems are concrete and the horizon is always the same distance away. They were going home. Whatever else was happening aboard the Deering in those final days, they were moving toward home. The temperature dropping, the sky becoming more familiar, the cold that was the cold of New England winters, the cold they had grown up in and understood in their bones. The pull of homecoming is one of the most powerful forces that operates on a person, and sailors feel it in a particular way after months at sea, in the particular way that people feel gravity when they have been away from it for long enough. Rest in that image for a moment. Not the silence of something terrible, but the silence that follows. The silence of a story that has run its course and left its mystery behind. The silence of the winter sea and the cold air and the ship settling on the shoal and the long wait for morning. The 5 agencies eventually stopped actively investigating the Carroll A Deering, not because the case was solved, not because anyone had confessed or been arrested or had been found floating in the Atlantic or living quietly under an assumed name in some coastal town. The investigation stopped because investigations stop, because there are only so many times you can re-interview witnesses who have nothing new to add, because the physical evidence has been examined until it yields nothing further, because the financial cost of continuing an inquiry that shows no sign of producing a resolution eventually outweighs the benefit of the inquiry itself. The file was closed, formally, though the case was never officially declared solved. It remains, in the technical sense, an open investigation, a case without a verdict, a mystery without a resolution. The records are held in the National Archives, where they have been consulted by researchers and writers and curious people for the better part of a century. The records are detailed and extensive, and they end, invariably, in the same place: uncertainty. The Deering family, the family of the ship's builder for whom she was named, pressed for answers for years after the ship was found. They had an obvious interest in knowing what had happened to a vessel that bore their name, that had been built by their business, that was part of their commercial legacy. They hired private investigators at one point. They corresponded with government agencies. They never received an answer that satisfied them. The families of the crew members also waited. The wife of Captain Warmell, the families of the 10 men who went out on the ship and did not come back. These families were owed explanations that were never provided, closure that was never offered. They were left with the open question and the long silence, which is perhaps the cruelest thing that a mystery inflicts on those who were closest to it. Over the subsequent decades, the Carroll A. Deering became one of those stories that circulates in the maritime world and beyond, told in sailors' bars and in nautical histories, and in the popular mystery books that have always had an appetite for disappearances. The story has the quality that great mysteries have, the quality of being both specific enough to feel real and ambiguous enough to remain unresolved. You can hold the Deering case in your mind and turn it over and feel every angle of it and never arrive at a place where you can set it down and walk away from it satisfied. That is, in its way, a tribute to the 10 people whose story this is. They remain unresolved. They remain present, in the record and in the telling, in a way that the simply disappeared often do not. They are not forgotten. They are argued about. They are theorized about. They are, in the literature of maritime mystery, immortal in the way that puzzles are immortal, as long as people are still trying to solve them. The ship herself is gone. She was refloated from Diamond Shoals, examined further, found to be beyond economical repair, and scuttled at sea in 1921. The red hull, that C.O. Brady saw from the beach, the 5 masts and the great sails, the cook's galley and the captain's quarters and the crew's forecastle, all of it went down into the Atlantic, and the sea closed over it, and that part of the story was finished. What remains is the paper record, the accounts and the reports and the statements and the theories, and the questions that the paper record cannot answer. What remains is the mystery, which is itself a kind of presence, a shape in the narrative of maritime history that takes up space, the way a missing piece takes up space in a puzzle, defined by its absence, more conspicuous for not being there than it would be if it were. There is a lighthouse on Cape Hatteras. It has been there since 1870, the tallest brick lighthouse in the United States, a spiral of black and white stripes, rising from the sandy point of the cape, its light flashing in a pattern that ships have used for navigational reference for generations. The lighthouse was moved in 1999, shifted back from the encroaching sea that was threatening its foundation, its enormous mass transported on a track system by engineers who took pride in the achievement of moving a lighthouse half a kilometre without destroying it. The lighthouse still stands, its light still turns. Ships still pass Cape Hatteras on the way up and down the coast, though most of them now are powered by engines rather than wind. Most of them are steel rather than wood. Most of them carry GPS systems that would have seemed like magic to the navigator of a 1,921 sailing schooner. On certain nights, when the sky is clear and the sea is running smooth and the light from the lighthouse sweeps across the water in its steady rhythm, the diamond shoals are visible in the shallows offshore. The water breaks there in a particular way, the waves showing white where they run over the sand, a pattern that any experienced sailor learns to read as warning. Stay away. The shoals are here. The graveyard is here. The Carroll A Deering ran onto those shoals 100 years ago. She sat there for 2 days, her hull in the sand, her sails catching the winter wind, her crew nowhere to be found. She has been at the bottom of the sea for most of a century since, and the sands have shifted over her, and the sea creatures have made their homes in her hold, and the winter storms have rearranged whatever was left of her over the long years. The mystery persists at the surface. It always will. Not because no one is trying to solve it, but because the sea solved it in its own way, by taking the evidence along with the crew, by closing over the truth of what happened with the cold and impersonal finality that is one of the sea's particular gifts. Somewhere in the cold water off Cape Hatteras, the truth of what happened to the Carroll A Deering is fixed and permanent and inaccessible. It happened. It is real. It has always been there, in the record of what the universe did with those particular molecules and those particular people, on those particular days, in January 1921. We simply cannot read it from where we are. That is all right. Not everything is meant to be read. Some things are meant to be experienced as mystery, as the open question that remains after all the answers have been tried and found insufficient. The Deering is one of those things. She has been a mystery for a century, and she will be a mystery for another century, or until some piece of evidence surfaces from the deep that no one has yet imagined, and closes the loop that has been open since the day a surfman named Brady walked the beach and saw a ship without a crew. Rest now in the mystery. It is a safe kind of mystery. It belongs to the past, to the sea, to the cold Atlantic of a winter morning 100 years gone. It cannot reach you where you are. It is only a story, only a ship, only the particular silence that follows when 10 people sail away and do not come back. The lighthouse turns. The light sweeps the water. The shoals are quiet in the dark. Sleep well. The Atlantic Ocean is old. Not old in the way that a building is old, or a mountain is old, though mountains are old enough. The Atlantic is old in the way that geological time is old, measured in tens of millions of years, in the slow drift of continents, in the patient work of water and salt and heat and pressure doing their long work on the rock and the sediment, and the accumulated debris of everything that has ever lived in or near or above the sea. The floor of the Atlantic is not the featureless plain that early charts imagined it to be. It is complex, ridged and folded, marked by the underwater mountain ranges where the oceanic plates meet and spread, pocked with the craters of ancient volcanic activity, layered with the sediment that has been falling from the surface for as long as there has been a surface to fall from, shells of microscopic organisms, the bones of whales, the rusted metal of ships, the wood of hulls, the personal effects of sailors. All of it is there, preserved in the cold and the dark and the pressure, in various states of dissolution and decay. The ocean is not a gentle keeper. Salt water is corrosive. The organisms that live in the deep have their own appetites, and they are not sentimental about what they consume. Wood rots, eventually, even in the cold. Metal rusts. Fabric dissolves. The body returns to its constituent elements faster in the ocean than on land, because the ocean is full of life that is glad of the material, and yet things are preserved. The right conditions, the right temperature and pressure and chemical environment can slow the dissolution to near nothing. Shipwrecks in the deep ocean have been found after a century or more with startling details intact, the captain's personal items still in their places, the cargo still in the hold, the very shape of the ship still recognizable, even when the wood itself has been replaced by the rust and concretion that grows over iron fittings. The Carroll A Deering does not lie in the deep ocean. She was scuttled in coastal waters, in relatively shallow water, in the kind of environment where preservation is more complicated. The coastal ocean is busier than the deep, more variable in its chemistry, more subject to the action of currents and biological activity. What remains of the Deering on the floor of the Atlantic off the Carolina coast is, after 100 years, probably not much that is recognizable. The wood of her hull, the timber that smelled of the main sawmill when she was built, is long since gone to the organisms that make their living in the shallows. The iron of her fittings has corroded into the characteristic red-brown of iron oxide, the rust that is iron's way of returning to the earth. But the sediment holds its records. The layer of material that settled on top of the Deering in the first years after she was scuttled is different from the sediment that settled after, is distinct from the layers above and below it, in ways that a careful geologist could read. the way tree rings are red for weather, the way ice cores are red for climate. The ocean writes its history in layers, and each layer is a page, and the pages go down and down into the dark until you reach the bedrock, where the writing begins. The layer that covers the Deering contains the particles of 1,921, the particular chemical signature of that year's ocean, whatever was in the water then that has since settled out. It contains the microscopic shells of organisms that lived their brief lives and fell, and the traces of weather and seasons, and perhaps, in some form too diffuse to be meaningful, some molecular remnant of the human presence that the ship once held. This is fanciful, perhaps, but it is true that the ocean keeps everything, in some form, even when the form is unreadable. The atoms that were Willis Wormel are in the ocean, or in the air above the ocean, or in the organisms that live there, cycling through the system that the planet uses to recycle everything. The atoms that were Herbert Bates's last meal are in the system. The atoms of the cook's stove and the captain's logbook and the red paint of the hull, nothing is lost. It is only redistributed, made part of something else, returned to the common material that the universe uses to build the next thing. This is not comfort exactly, in the way that people usually mean comfort, but it is a kind of truth that has its own quiet weight. The Atlantic winter off Cape Hatteras is cold and grey, and, on the right kind of day, very beautiful. The light in winter comes at a low angle, which means that the water catches it differently than it does in summer, scattering it in ways that make the surface look like hammered metal, like pewter, like the grey silk of certain kinds of fabric. The foam of the breaking waves is very white against that grey, and the birds that work the surf, the pelicans and the gannets and the various species of gull, are very black and white against the sky. On a day like that, standing on the beach at Cape Hatteras, with the lighthouse behind you and the wind coming in off the water, and the diamond shoals visible as a pattern of white water in the distance, you can understand why people have always given this coast a special quality in their imaginations. It has the feel of a boundary, of a place where one thing ends and another begins. The land ends here. The ocean begins. The familiar world stops at the beach and the unknown world starts at the water's edge. Sailors have always understood this boundary in a way that land people often do not. The sea is not simply a large body of water. It is a different country, with different rules, different time, different ways of measuring progress and distance and risk. You take something with you when you cross that boundary, and you leave something behind, and what you bring back is not always the same as what you left with. The crew of the Carroll A. Deering crossed that boundary in the summer of 1920, when the ship left Portland, Maine, on her last voyage. They crossed it fully committed, as sailors must commit, without reservation about the sea's terms. They went where the ship went. They did the work that needed doing. They ate the meals the cook prepared, and stood their watches in the dark and carried out the orders given by the officers, and lived the life that sailors live on a long commercial voyage. And then something happened, and then they were gone. The sea keeps them. Whatever else is true of this story, that part is true. The sea that they committed their lives to received their lives in the end, as the sea receives all the lives that are committed to it, not with ceremony or acknowledgement, with the simple absorption that is the sea's way. We can tell their story, we can say their names, we can wonder as people have wondered for 100 years about what happened in those final days. We can examine the evidence and propose theories and disagree about the probability of each. We can keep the mystery alive in the telling, which is a kind of keeping faith with the people at the centre of it. The lighthouse turns on Cape Hatteras. The light sweeps across Diamond Shoals. The winter sea moves in its ancient rhythm, indifferent and magnificent and cold. The Carroll A. Deering sailed these waters. Her crew worked and ate and slept and kept their watches. The cook made dinner. The captain worried. The first mate was angry, or afraid, or calculating, or simply difficult in the way that some people are simply difficult without deeper reason. And the sea received them, and the mystery persists. And we are here, listening to it in the warmth and the dark, as the story settles around us like sediment settling in still water, finding its depth, coming to rest. The Carroll A. Deering was not the only ship to vanish from the Atlantic coast in the early 1920s. She is the most famous, in part because of the particular nature of her disappearance, the ship found on the shoal with dinner on the stove, and in part because of the sustained official investigation that followed. But she was one of a number of vessels that went missing in those waters during that era, a pattern that investigators at the time noted and that has been examined by researchers ever since. The pattern is this. In the years immediately following World War I and coinciding with the early years of Prohibition, an unusual number of ships and crews disappeared from the waters off the American eastern seaboard. Some of these disappearances had obvious explanations: storms, mechanical failures, the ordinary hazards of maritime life. But some of them did not, and the ones that did not cluster in a way that suggests, to some researchers, a common cause. The common cause most often proposed is rum-running. The illegal alcohol trade that flourished in the early years of Prohibition required both boats to carry the contraband and a degree of criminal violence to protect the trade routes and eliminate witnesses and competitors. A ship's crew that had seen something they should not have seen, or a ship that had been used for smuggling and was now a liability, would have been a problem that certain kinds of criminal organizations would have felt capable of solving in direct and brutal ways. This is speculation, as so much in the Deering case is speculation, but it is speculation grounded in historical reality. The early Prohibition era was genuinely violent. The organized crime that grew up around the alcohol trade was genuinely capable of violence, and the sea is genuinely a convenient place to make people disappear in a way that land-based crime is not. The investigators who examined the Deering case were aware of these other disappearances. They are referenced in the investigation records, in the reports filed by the various agencies. The State Department in particular was interested in whether the Deering case was connected to a larger pattern, whether it was an isolated incident or part of an organized criminal operation targeting ships and crews in the Atlantic. They could not establish a connection. The evidence was too thin, the specific cases too different from each other in their details, the overall record of maritime disappearances too complicated by the genuine hazards of the sea to allow for a clear identification of a pattern that was criminal rather than natural. And yet the pattern is there, in the record, in the clustering of incidents in the early 1920s. Whether it means anything specific is a question that cannot be answered with the evidence available. The sea has always been a place where people disappear without explanation. Before the era of GPS and satellite communication and modern meteorology, the sea was a much more dangerous and unpredictable environment than it is today. Ships went down in storms that were not forecast. Ships ran aground on coasts that were poorly charted. Ships were lost to structural failures that better materials and engineering would later prevent. Crews died of disease, of accident, of the ordinary violence of maritime life in an era before the safety standards and the rescue services that exist today. The Carroll A. Deering case stands out against this background of ordinary maritime tragedy, not because maritime disasters were unusual, but because of the specific nature of what was found and what was not found. A ship in reasonably good condition, a meal on the stove, deliberate damage to the navigation and steering, 10 men absent, no bodies, no lifeboats found with crew, no witnesses who could say what they had seen. This specific combination of evidence is what distinguishes the Deering from the ordinary maritime disappearance, the kind of loss that produces a wreck, or bodies or survivors or some combination of the three. The Deering produced none of these in the forms that would resolve the question. She produced only the unanswered question itself. There is a theory, proposed by some researchers, that the Deering was intercepted by another vessel whose crew was engaged in rum-running, and that the Deering's crew was transferred to that vessel, possibly by force, and was then taken somewhere and either killed or dispersed. Under this theory, the Deering herself was then set adrift with her anchors cut and her steering disabled, to prevent easy recovery, and she drifted north to Diamond Shoals on the current. This theory has the virtue of explaining most of the physical evidence in a coherent way. It explains why the crew left in the lifeboats, or why the lifeboats were launched. It explains why the steering and navigation were disabled. It even explains the message at Cape Fear, which might have been sent by a crew member who was trying to communicate distress in a way that would not alert his captors, using the pretext of a message about lost anchors to establish that the ship had been in contact with the shore. But it does not explain what happened to the crew after they were transferred. It does not explain where they went or what became of them. It does not explain why no one ever talked, why no member of any crew that might have been involved ever mentioned it in all the years and decades since. The silence in all of these theories is the hardest thing to explain. People are not good at keeping secrets indefinitely. Time passes, Circumstances change, death approaches, and the things that seem necessary to conceal become less urgent, and the desire to confess or to explain, or simply to tell someone what you know, becomes more powerful. In 100 years, not one person has come forward with knowledge of what happened to the Deering's crew, not one deathbed confession, not one letter discovered among the papers of someone who was there, not one account from someone who saw something they should not have seen. Either the secret has been kept with extraordinary discipline across a century and multiple individuals, or there is no secret to keep, because the people who knew what happened are as dead as the crew of the Deering, having been silenced by the same event that silenced the crew, or the disappearance was the result of a natural catastrophe that left no survivors and no witnesses, and the physical evidence that seems to suggest human agency was either misinterpreted or the result of something that happened earlier in the voyage that does not connect directly to the final disappearance. All of these possibilities remain open. None of them can be closed. The century has passed and the file remains open, and the sea remains silent on the subject, as it has always been silent, as it will always be silent. The pattern of the sea is not a pattern that resolves into meaning. It is a pattern of accumulation, of layer upon layer of the things that have happened in these waters and been absorbed by these waters, without annotation, without explanation, without the narrative arc that human beings impose on events to make them comprehensible. The Deering is part of that pattern. 10 people, a ship, a winter morning, a warm stove, and the sea, patient and cold and indifferent, holding what it holds. That is the pattern. That is the sea. And here, in the warmth of the place where you are resting, that pattern is very far away, belonging to a coast and a winter and a year that are all in the past, all settled and fixed in the amber of history, unable to reach you here in the quiet dark where the story lives only as sound, as voice, as the gentle presence of something being told. A century is a long time, long enough for the people who were alive when the Carroll A. Deering ran aground on Diamond Shoals to have lived their full lives and passed on, long enough for the children of those people to have lived full lives. Long enough for the world those people inhabited to have changed so thoroughly that it would be nearly unrecognizable to them. In 1921, there were no commercial airlines. Automobiles existed but were not universally owned. Radio was in its infancy. Television did not exist. The internet was more than half a century away from being imagined. The political map of the world looked different. The social assumptions of the world looked different. The technology of communication and navigation and rescue that now makes the sea a less mysterious and less deadly place than it was then did not yet exist. In 1921, a ship could sail into the winter Atlantic and simply not come back, and the people who waited for it could wait a very long time before anyone had any idea of what had happened. The sea was larger then, in the sense that the tools for crossing it and searching it and understanding it were so much more limited than they are now. A ship missing at sea in 1921 was in a fundamentally different situation from a ship missing at sea today, when satellite tracking and emergency beacons and Coast Guard aviation and global communication make the actual location of any ship theoretically knowable at any moment. The Deering sailed in the last years of the old maritime world, the world before the modern communications and navigation technology that has made the sea, if not safe, at least less opaque. She was, in a sense, one of the last ships that could disappear completely, that could vanish from the available record without leaving any trace in the systems that now monitor the movements of vessels across the world's oceans. That fact is worth holding, gently, as this story comes toward its close. The mystery of the Carroll A. Deering is partly a mystery of technology, of an era when the instruments of knowing were so much cruder than the instruments of today, that events which now would be recorded and analysed and understood could then simply disappear into the gap between what was known and what was knowable. We are richer in knowledge now, and in a certain sense poorer in mystery. The unexplained corners of the world have shrunk, not because the world has become simpler, but because the tools for seeing it have become more powerful. There are fewer places for ships to vanish, fewer stretches of sea that are genuinely unmonitored, fewer moments in the life of a commercial vessel that are not recorded somewhere. This is, on balance, a good thing. The families of the Deering's crew deserve to know what happened to the people they were waiting for. The safety of sailors is worth the trade of some mystery. The progress of technology that has made the sea more knowable has also made it more survivable, and that is not nothing. But something is lost too. The sense of the sea as genuinely other, genuinely beyond the reach of ordinary understanding, genuinely capable of absorbing events without explanation. That sense has diminished. The sea is still dangerous. It is still capable of killing people. It is still, in the deepest ocean, largely unexplored and poorly understood. But the surface of the sea, the part where ships sail and where the Deering's story unfolded, is less mysterious now than it was then. The Carroll A. Deering exists in the space that has closed. She belongs to the era when the sea could keep secrets of this magnitude, when 10 people and a ship could go into the Atlantic and simply not return, and no one, despite years of effort, could say with certainty what had happened. She is the last great ghost ship of the old maritime world. In a sense, the last ship that achieved the full mystery of disappearance before the age of tracking and communication made that kind of disappearance impossible. There is something elegiac about that. Something worth acknowledging, quietly, in the space between the telling and the listening. The Cape Hatteras lighthouse still stands. It was built to mark a dangerous coast, to give sailors a point of reference, to say, here is where you are, here is the land, navigate accordingly. For the Carroll A, Deering in her last days, it would have been visible, that lighthouse, as the ship moved north along the coast. The crew would have known it, would have used it if they were using the navigation instruments that were later found to be missing or damaged. Maybe the lighthouse was the last familiar landmark some of them saw. The rotating light, the black and white stripes of the tower, the sandy cape reaching into the sea, the familiar geography of the American coast that said, you are nearly home. Or maybe they never saw it. Maybe whatever happened had already happened by then, and the ship was already empty, already drifting on the current that would carry her to Diamond Shoals, and the lighthouse swept its beam across the red hull of a vessel, with no one to receive the signal. We do not know. We will not know. The lighthouse does not remember what it illuminated on those January nights 100 years ago, and even if it did, it has no language for telling. The sea moves, the stars turn. The cold winter air comes off the Atlantic, and smells of salt and distance, and the deep cold of water that goes down a long way before it hits the bottom. 10 people, a ship, a mystery. The mystery is at peace now, in the way that old mysteries are at peace, settled into the fabric of history, no longer urgent, no longer anguishing for the people who lived inside it. The families are gone. The investigators are gone. The officials who wrote the reports and filed the records and eventually closed the active investigation are gone. Everyone who had a personal stake in the answer is gone. What remains is the story itself, and the telling of it, and the quiet that follows the telling. You are in that quiet now. The story has moved through you and come to its end, not with an answer, but with the mystery intact. The same mystery it has always been, unchanged by the telling, but perhaps a little more familiar, a little more present. The Carroll A. Deering rests at the bottom of the Atlantic, somewhere off the coast of North Carolina, in the cold dark. The lighthouse turns above. The shoals are quiet. The sea moves in its ancient way, neither remembering nor forgetting, simply being what it has always been. You can rest now too. Let the story settle. Let the sea recede. Let the cold Atlantic morning of a century ago become just a story, just a voice, just the sound of something being told in the warmth and dark. The ship is quiet. The ocean is quiet. The mystery is quiet. And you can be quiet too. To truly understand the Carroll A. Deering story, it is worth understanding the world she was sailing through in the winter of 1921. Not merely the geography, not merely the waters and the weather, but the human world, the social and economic and political reality of the eastern seaboard of the United States at that particular moment in history. It was a world that was changing rapidly, a world that had been shaken by the catastrophe of the Great War, and was finding its way toward a new order that would itself eventually collapse. It was a world where old things and new things existed side by side in ways that sometimes seemed contradictory, where a horse-drawn cart and an automobile might share the same street, where radio broadcasts were beginning to reach into households that still used ice boxes instead of refrigerators. The Carroll A. Deering was herself an emblem of this transitional moment. She was a sailing schooner, a type of vessel whose time was already passing in 1921. The age of sail was not quite over, but it was ending. Steam-powered vessels and increasingly diesel-powered vessels were taking over the commercial shipping routes that sailing ships had once dominated. Steamships were more reliable, less dependent on the vagaries of wind, faster on average, and increasingly more economical to operate as the technology improved. The sailing schooner that had been the workhorse of American coastal commerce for generations was becoming an anachronism. The Deering's owner, G.G. Deering, was operating in a market that was contracting. The commercial sailing ship business had been declining for years before the Deering was built, and the people in the industry knew it. Ships like the Deering were being built and operated as long as the economics supported it, which was not indefinitely. The margins were thinner than they had been. The competition was fiercer. The crews were sometimes harder to find, because sailors who had experience with steam were in greater demand, and the old sail skills were becoming less common among the maritime labour pool. Captain Wormel was a product of this world. He had spent his life on sailing vessels, and the skills he had accumulated over decades of maritime service, the reading of wind and weather, the management of sails and rigging, the navigation by compass and star, were skills that the new maritime world was beginning to value less than it once had. He was not yet obsolete, but the world that had formed him was becoming obsolete around him, the way the worlds of skilled tradespeople often become obsolete around them, as technology shifts the terms of what is valued. The crew of the Deering was similarly a product of this world, men who knew how to handle a sailing vessel, who had spent years working the coastal trade in an era when the coastal trade was being transformed. Some of them had probably worked on steam vessels as well. Some of them had probably spent time ashore between voyages, doing whatever work was available, the kind of mixed working life that maritime workers of that era typically led. A voyage here, some shore work there, another voyage when the opportunity arose. The ports they had visited on the Deering's last voyage were also a world unto themselves. Portland, Maine, at the beginning of the voyage, was a working port city, practical and cold and built around the business of the sea. Rio de Janeiro, at the voyage's midpoint, was a different world entirely, a South American port city in the tropics, with all the heat and complexity and social stratification that implied. Bridgetown, Barbados, was the last port of call, a Caribbean colonial port with its own particular social geography, its own hierarchy, its own way of conducting the business of ships and sailors. In Bridgetown, the interaction between the ship and the shore had produced the evidence of tension that would later be so important to the investigation. Captain Wormel going to the consul, McClellan making statements in portside establishments. The visible friction between the two men that was apparently obvious enough to be noted by people who had no particular reason to observe it. Why was McClellan so angry? This is a question that the investigation never fully answered, and that has continued to be asked in the retellings of the Deering story. The accounts suggest a man who was difficult in general, whose temperament was such that conflict followed him. But there may have been specific grievances as well, specific things about the Deering voyage, about the way Wormel ran the ship, about the conditions or the treatment, or some particular incident that had brought McClellan's general difficulty to a particular boiling point by the time the ship reached Barbados. The maritime labour market of 1921 was not a labour market with strong protections for workers. Sailors had limited recourse when they felt they were being treated unfairly. The captain's authority was, as noted earlier, nearly absolute within the confines of the ship. A first mate who had a genuine grievance, a complaint about conditions or pay or treatment that in a modern workplace would have channels for resolution, had few options on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic in 1921. He could endure, or he could create conflict, or he could wait until the ship reached port and then resign. McClellan apparently chose conflict. Whether that conflict extended to the extreme of what the mutiny theory suggests, or whether it remained at the level of verbal hostility and general insubordination, is not clear from the evidence. What is clear is that by the time the Deering left Barbados, the situation on board had deteriorated to the point where the captain was frightened enough to seek help from an official representative of his government. The harbour of Bridgetown, as the Deering prepared to depart, would have been busy in the way that tropical ports are busy in winter. The height of the season for ships coming down from the colder north, the time of year when the Caribbean receives the greatest traffic from vessels escaping the cold of the higher latitudes. There would have been other ships in the harbour. Other crews. The ordinary background noise of a working port, the cargo being loaded and unloaded, the small boats moving between ship and shore, the sounds of the city carrying over the water. The Deering raised her anchor and motored, or sailed, out of the harbour. Her bow pointed north. The tropical sky overhead would have been a deep blue, the kind of blue that you only see at that latitude, a blue that seems to go up forever, that makes the sky look like a different material from what it is in the grey north. The water of the harbour would have been clear and warm, the colours shifting from green to blue as the depth increased, the coral visible below the surface in the shallower parts. And then the harbour opened into the open sea, and the Deering was alone with the Atlantic again, and the Caribbean air gave way slowly to the Atlantic air as she moved north, and the water changed its colour and its temperature and its character, and the sky began to take on the quality of the northern sky, the lower clouds, the more uncertain light. The route north from Barbados was one that experienced Atlantic sailors knew in detail, a route that had been sailed by commercial vessels for as long as there had been commercial vessels on the Atlantic, which is to say for centuries. The merchants of the colonial era had moved along this same corridor, the ships carrying sugar and rum and molasses from the Caribbean to the American colonies, returning with lumber and fish and manufactured goods. The slave ships had moved along routes that intersected this corridor, their cargo the most terrible cargo that any ship has ever carried. The warships of 4 centuries of Atlantic conflict had patrolled these same waters. The route was old. It was worn into the Atlantic the way a path is worn into a landscape by generations of passage. The Deering moved along this old route as ships had always moved along it, dependent on wind and current in the way that sailing ships are always dependent on these forces, making progress when the conditions favoured progress, and waiting when they did not. The Gulf Stream helps vessels moving north along this corridor, the current adding a knot or two to the ship's speed over the ground, the warm water from the tropics flowing north and east, with a force that can be felt in the way the ship moves through it. She sailed north through the Caribbean and into the waters of the Gulf Stream. She passed through the waters off Florida, where the stream runs strong and blue and warm even in winter, where the coast of Florida is visible to the west on a clear day, the low sandy shoreline with its new developments and its hotels being built for the tourists who were just beginning to discover the pleasure of the Florida winter. The Deering was a working ship, not a pleasure vessel, and she did not stop there. She sailed on. She came into the waters off Georgia and South Carolina, where the Gulf Stream begins to pull away from the coast, and the water becomes greyer and colder, where the sea character begins to change from tropical to temperate. The weather was January weather now, or soon would be, the kind of cold that comes off the Atlantic in the deep of the northern winter, not the killing cold of the far north, but a penetrating damp cold that makes itself felt through layers of clothing. She sailed on. The Cape Fear lightship appeared in the distance, the lightship that marked the entrance to the Cape Fear River, that served as a navigational reference point for vessels moving up and down the coast. The Deering hailed it. The crew member with the megaphone called across the water about the lost anchors. And then the Deering sailed on, past the lightship, continuing north, and whatever was happening aboard her continued to happen, and the sea moved and the wind blew, and the cold Atlantic winter wrapped itself around a ship full of people who were about to disappear. 2 days later, or thereabouts, she ran on to Diamond Shoals. The world she sailed through still exists, in its broad outlines. The Atlantic coast is still the Atlantic coast. The shoals are still there. The lighthouse still stands at Cape Hatteras. The geography is the same. But the world of 1921, the specific human world that the Deering moved through, the world of wooden sailing ships and prohibition and maritime labour law, as it was then, that world is as completely gone as the crew of the Deering themselves. It belongs to the past, to the sealed-off rooms of history that you can visit in imagination but not in fact. The imagination that visits those rooms tonight, travelling through this story, finds them quiet. The harbour of Bridgetown is quiet. The open Atlantic is quiet. The cold January sea off Cape Hatteras is quiet. The world of 1921 is very quiet now. 100 years on, all its urgencies resolved one way or another, all its people at rest. It is a quiet that makes the present quiet easier to settle into. The past is peaceful in a way that the present rarely is. The past has already happened. Its outcomes are fixed. Its dramas are over. You can visit it as a place of rest, a place where nothing more is demanded, where the only thing required is to listen. You are listening, and the past is quiet, and the winter sea is quiet, and the story continues toward its end, moving through the dark the way a ship moves through the dark, with the current and the wind going where the water takes it. It is the warm stove that people remember, of all the details of the Carroll A, Deering case, of all the strange and puzzling elements that the boarding party found when they climbed onto the empty schooner on the 1st of February, 1921. It is this detail that has lodged most persistently in the imagination of everyone who has heard the story. A ship without a crew, a meal that was never eaten, the stove still warm. There is something about this detail that speaks to a very particular kind of absence. The absence that is created not by the lack of all evidence of life, but by the presence of evidence of life, interrupted. The ship was not a bare hull, empty and cold and obviously abandoned. The ship was a place where someone had been, recently, doing the most ordinary thing, preparing food, and then had stopped, had left, had been taken or had gone, in a way so sudden or so complete that the food remained, and the stove remained warm, and the preparations for a meal remained in place. Abandoned houses have this quality. Empty offices after a sudden evacuation, the table set for a dinner party that was never held. There is a specific kind of melancholy in a space that has been prepared for human presence, and then left before that presence could fully inhabit it, a space that holds the shape of what was intended, without holding the thing itself. The Deering's galley held the shape of a meal. The cook had done his work. He had managed the coal stove, had probably started it hours before the meal was due to be ready, had nursed it through the process of reaching the right temperature for what he was preparing. He had gathered his ingredients from the ship's stores, had begun the preparation that a ship's cook knows from long practice. The sequence of steps that produces a meal from raw ingredients under conditions that would challenge a land-based cook. What was he thinking about? What does a cook think about while he prepares a meal on a long ocean voyage in January? Perhaps he was thinking about home, about the end of the voyage that was now very close, about the things he would do when the ship made port and his time on this particular vessel was complete. Perhaps he was thinking about the tension on the ship, about the conflict between the captain and the first mate that must have been perceptible to everyone in the close quarters of a sailing schooner. Perhaps he was thinking about nothing more elevated than the meal itself, the sequence of steps, the management of time and heat and ingredients that is the cook's professional meditation. The galley of a sailing vessel is a small space. On a ship of the Deering size, the galley would have been a room of perhaps 10 by 12 feet at the most, fitted with the coal stove and its flue, with storage cabinets for the provisions and the cooking equipment, with perhaps a small working surface for preparation. The ceiling would have been low, as all ceilings below deck were low on vessels of that era. The light would have come from whatever portholes existed and from lanterns or the ship's electrical system, if it had one. In January, in the North Atlantic, the light through those portholes would have been the cold, grey winter light, the kind of light that does not warm even when the sky is clear. The stove would have been the main source of warmth in the galley, and the cook would have been grateful for it, working in proximity to the heat of it, the way kitchen workers have always been warmed by the heat of their own work. The smell in the galley would have been the smell of whatever was cooking, the particular smell that the specific dish produced, overlaid on the background smell of all the previous meals cooked in that space, the accumulated seasoning of hundreds of meals at sea, the grease and the salt and the coal smoke and the specific character of a ship's galley that everyone who has spent time on a working vessel recognizes. And then he stopped, or something stopped him, or someone came to the galley door and told him something, or something happened that made the meal irrelevant, that made the stove and the food and the careful preparation of the previous hours become background to something more urgent. We do not know what. We will never know what. The cook is not here to tell us, and the stove is at the bottom of the Atlantic with the rest of the ship, and the meal itself has long since dissolved into whatever it dissolved into over the cold winter days after the boarding party found it. The warm stove has become a kind of symbol, not deliberately, not through any choice of the cook or the captain or anyone connected to the Deering. It became a symbol because it spoke to something that people recognize instinctively, the interrupted ordinary, the moment when normal life was stopped in the middle of its most normal activity. Historians of maritime mystery and writers who have covered the Deering case have used the warm stove and the abandoned meal as shorthand for the mystery's essence. The phrase is almost invariable in accounts of the case: dinner still on the stove, or some variation thereof. It is the hook, the image that opens the story and returns to it, the sensory detail that makes the abstract mystery concrete. It is concrete because we all know what it means to prepare a meal. We all know the series of decisions and actions that leads to food on a stove, the planning and the shopping and the preparation and the monitoring. We know the investment of time and attention that cooking represents. And we know that you do not leave a meal you are preparing without a reason, without something that calls you away, without something that makes the meal less important than whatever else is happening. Whatever called Herbert Bates away from that stove was important enough to stop everything. Important enough that he did not turn off the stove, or take the pot off the heat, or do any of the things a careful cook does when he has to leave the kitchen unexpectedly. He left it as it was, burning, cooking, the stove warm and the food on it, because whatever took him away from it did not allow for those small, careful acts of tending. Or he intended to come back. Maybe he stepped away for a moment, expecting to return in minutes, expecting to finish the meal and call the crew and serve the food in the normal way. Maybe whatever happened so quickly that he had no chance to return, no chance to do anything but be part of whatever the event was. The event, the thing that happened. The thing that took 10 people off a ship that was otherwise in good enough order to be grounded on Diamond Shoals without sinking, that left the food on the stove and the log entries going up to a certain point, and nothing after that point, nothing. But the empty ship and the cold grey winter sea and the quiet that has settled over this story for 100 years. Let the warm stove be the image you carry out of this story, if you carry any image at all. Not as a mystery, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a human thing, a meal prepared with care, a small act of daily life that speaks of all the other small acts of daily life that the crew of the Deering performed over the months of their voyage. The watches stood and the sails trimmed and the ropes coiled and the log kept and the meals made. All of it ordinary. All of it the substance of 10 lives being lived as lives are lived, in the particular present of each moment, without knowledge of how many moments remained. The stove was warm. The food was there. The people were not. That is the mystery. That is all of it, in the smallest possible space. And now you can let it rest. Let it settle into the quiet dark of the night, where it will keep its shape without demanding anything from you, where it will remain what it has always been, a story told across 100 years, a ship and a sea and a warm stove, and the silence that followed. There is a particular quality to the night on the open ocean that you cannot fully understand without having experienced it. It is a quality of darkness that does not exist on land, a darkness without the ambient light of cities or towns or roads, without the windows of houses or the headlights of passing cars. On a clear night far from shore, the stars are present in a way that is almost overwhelming, as if the usual haze of light pollution has been lifted to reveal the actual sky, the real number of stars that exist above us and that we almost never see. The crews of working sailing vessels in 1921 lived with this darkness. They were accustomed to it. The night watch, standing at the helm or moving around the deck checking the rigging and the sails, worked in a world lit only by stars and by whatever running lights the ship carried, the red and green navigation lights that told other ships which way she was heading, and perhaps a lantern or two for working light. The darkness was not something to be feared, not for experienced sailors. It was simply the condition of the work, but it had a quality, a presence. The ocean at night, especially in winter, especially in the grey Atlantic, is a different kind of place than the ocean in daylight. The sounds are different. The visual horizon is gone, replaced by a vague boundary between the darkness of the water and the darker darkness of the sky. Or on a cloudy night, no boundary at all, just undifferentiated dark in every direction, beyond the small circle of the ship's lights. The sounds of the ship are more present at night, the groan of the rigging under wind load, the deep sound of the hull moving through water, a sustained low rumble that you feel as much as hear, that the body records as a vibration in the bones as much as a sound in the ears, the creak of the masts in their partners, the slap of a loose line against the deck or the spar. All of these sounds are there in the daytime too, but in the daytime they are part of a larger sensory world, mixed in with the visual information and the feel of the wind and the particular quality of the light. At night, They become the primary information. They become the ship talking to itself, or to you. The night watch on a sailing vessel is a meditation in the most literal sense. You are awake, and the ship is moving, and the world has reduced itself to the information available in the dark, and there is nothing to do but be present to that information, to monitor it, to notice any change that might require action. The watch stands at the helm, or walks the deck, and the mind does what minds do in the absence of external stimulation. It wanders, it returns. It wanders again, it becomes a little loose at the edges, a little less distinct in its boundaries than it is in the busy daytime. The men who stood watch on the Carroll A, deering on her final voyage, would have experienced this. The men who stood the middle watch, from midnight to 4 in the morning, or the morning watch from 4 until 8, would have stood at the helm in the cold January dark and felt the ship moving under them and listened to the sounds of the rigging and watched the stars. If there were stars, or the cloud-covered sky, if there were clouds, they would have breathed the cold salt air and felt the wind on their faces and done the small adjustments of the wheel that keep a sailing vessel on course. What were they thinking about on those final nights? Did they know that something was wrong? Did they sense the tension between the captain and the first mate in a way that made the night watches less peaceful than they might otherwise have been? Were they afraid? Or watchful? Or simply tired in the way of men at the end of a long voyage, wanting to be home, counting the days remaining? The stars that the night watch sailors on the Deering would have seen were the winter stars of the northern hemisphere, the same stars that sailors had used for navigation for millennia. Orion rising in the east, the hunter with his belt of 3 stars, one of the most recognizable patterns in the winter sky. The Pleiades above him, the 7 sisters that in ancient maritime tradition mark the safe sailing season's end. Polaris to the north, the fixed star around which everything else appears to rotate, the navigator's friend, the star that tells you where north is when everything else is moving. These stars are so old that the light they send down is older than our species, older than anything human, arriving from such distances that the journey of that light makes the history of the Deering and her mystery feel like something that happened in the last second of an enormously long story. Sailors have always lived under this paradox. The vastness of the sky above them, the smallness of their ship below, the particular human business of navigation and commerce and conflict carried on beneath stars that take no notice, that shine with the same cold indifference whether the voyage ends safely in port or on a sandy shoal in January. The night sky does not know about the Carroll A. Deering. It does not know about any of us. It simply shines, as it has always shined, as it will go on shining after we are gone. There is a comfort in that, for those who can find it. The indifference of the vast is not malice. It is simply scale. The stars are too far away to care, and their distance is a kind of peace. The night watch is a solitary experience. Even on a ship with other people below, the man at the helm at 3 in the morning is effectively alone. In the particular aloneness of the night watch, where the darkness and the ship's sounds and the absence of other people create a temporary isolation that has its own character. Some sailors love this time. Some find it oppressive. Most accept it as part of the work, neither seeking it nor avoiding it, simply standing it as it comes. In the nights before whatever happened, the watch rotations would have continued as they always continued. The watches would have changed, the men going below to sleep and the men coming up to stand their hours. The ship would have sailed north, the darkness giving way to the grey light of a winter dawn, the dawn giving way to the thin light of a January day, the day giving way to darkness again, and so on, in the rhythm that sailors live by for the duration of a voyage. The Cape Fear lightship would have been visible on one of those watches, the light blinking its identifying pattern in the darkness. The surfmen on the lightship, perhaps noting the Deering's passage, the megaphone call about the lost anchors carrying across the dark water, in a way that the lightship crew would later try to reconstruct and examine for meaning. Did the man who called from the Deering's deck know he was sending a distress signal of a kind? Was the message about the anchors a coded communication, a way of saying something is wrong here without saying it in a way that could be overheard? Or was it simply what it appeared to be, a maritime courtesy, a professional communication between ships, a crew member doing his job and informing the relevant shore station of a navigational issue? The lightship crew could not answer this question, and neither can we. The words crossed the water and were heard and recorded, and that is all. The intention behind them belongs to the person who spoke them, and that person has not been available for questioning for 100 years. Think of the night that followed that communication. The Deering sailing on north. The Cape Fear lightship falling behind. The crew, or what remained of the crew, or whoever was directing the ship's course, continuing northward. Diamond Shoal still ahead, out in the dark, the sandy shoal invisible below the water, the waves breaking over it in the cold winter sea. There would have been a watch that night. Someone was at the helm. Someone was monitoring the ship's progress. Or perhaps not. Perhaps by that night the situation had changed sufficiently that the normal watch schedule was no longer being maintained. Perhaps the ship was already being managed by a reduced number of people, or by people who were managing her for purposes other than the normal commercial voyage that had been her reason for existing. The night that the Deering ran onto Diamond Shoals is not recorded. We do not know if it was dark or if there was a moon. We do not know if the weather was rough or calm. We do not know if the shoals were visible in the breaking waves or invisible in smooth water. We do not know who, if anyone, was at the helm when the hull touched the sand. We only know that the ship ran aground, that she was on the shoal when Brady saw her the next morning, that the Coast Guard tried to reach her and could not because of the sea conditions, that she sat there for 2 days, 2 days of wind and wave, and the cold January light moving across an empty deck. 2 days of the galley stove cooling from warm to cold. 2 days of the sea working on the hull, the sand working on the keel, the rigging moving in the wind above a ship that had no one left to tend it. And then the cutter came, and the boarding party climbed aboard, and the galley was still warm, and the mystery began. The night watch is over. The ship is at rest. You are at rest. Let the darkness of the winter ocean become the darkness of the room where you are. Let the sound of the water become the sound of your own breath, regular and slow. And let the story move away from you the way a ship moves away in the dark. Its lights growing smaller and then gone, and the sea left alone with itself again, very quiet, very dark, very still. The Carroll A. Deering is the most famous ghost ship of the American Atlantic. But she is not the only one. The history of maritime mystery is full of vessels that disappeared, or were found empty, or vanished under circumstances that left more questions than answers. It is worth spending a little time with some of these other stories, not because they explain the Deering, but because they place her in a tradition, a long and sometimes melancholy tradition of ships and seas, and the mysteries they have made together over the centuries. The most famous ghost ship in maritime history is probably the Mary Celeste, a brigantine found adrift in the Atlantic in December 1872, with her crew of 8 mysteriously absent. Like the Deering, the Mary Celeste was found with signs of recent occupation, with the crew's personal effects present, and with no obvious explanation for the disappearance of everyone aboard. Like the Deering, the Mary Celeste became the subject of intense investigation and persistent theorizing that never produced a definitive answer. The Mary Celeste case predates the Deering by about 50 years, but the two cases share a structural similarity that has made them perennial companions in discussions of maritime mystery. Both ships were found afloat and intact. Both were missing their crews. Both showed signs that something had interrupted ordinary shipboard life. Both have generated numerous theories without a conclusive resolution. The differences are also instructive. The Mary Celeste's lifeboat was also missing, as with the Deering. But unlike the Deering, the Mary Celeste showed no signs of deliberate sabotage to her navigation or steering. The Mary Celeste's case has been theorized to have involved a cargo issue. The ship was carrying industrial alcohol, which could have produced vapors, and one theory suggests a sudden explosion or threat of explosion drove the crew to the lifeboat, from which they were subsequently lost. This theory is more satisfying than most Deering theories because it involves a mechanism that is at least plausible given the specific cargo. The Deering's cargo was not industrial alcohol. Her cargo situation on the return voyage is not entirely clear, which is itself a point of interest in the Rum-Runner theories. But whatever she was carrying, it does not provide the same kind of specific mechanical explanation that has been offered for the Mary Celeste. There is a vessel called the Resolute, a British Royal Navy ship that was abandoned in the Arctic in 1854 when she became icebound, and the crew decided to abandon her and make for shore. She was found the following year by an American whaling ship, drifting in the Atlantic, having worked herself free of the ice. The Resolute was refitted and returned to the Queen of England as a diplomatic gift. Her timbers were later used to build a desk, the Resolute Desk, which sits in the Oval Office of the White House. The Resolute story is not a mystery in the way the Deering's is, because the crew survived and could explain what had happened. But it illustrates the maritime reality that ships can become separated from their crews and drift for long distances, can be found floating and intact after everyone aboard has left, and can continue their material existence long after the human story associated with them has ended. The Deering's continued existence after her crew disappeared was brief. She was grounded, refloated, found to be uneconomical to repair, and scuttled. She did not drift for years and travel thousands of miles like the Resolute. She ran onto a shoal and stayed there until human decisions about her fate were made, and then she was disposed of in the manner that damaged ships are disposed of when they are beyond saving. There are ships that have disappeared without being found, whose fate is entirely unknown, whose crews and cargoes and the reasons for their loss are sealed in the ocean with no surface evidence at all. These complete disappearances are in some ways more comfortable than the partial disappearances, the ghost ships, because they offer nothing to puzzle over. The complete disappearance says, the ship is gone. The partial disappearance says, the ship was here, and something happened, but what? The ghost ship is the most unsettling category of maritime loss, precisely because it provides enough evidence to establish that something unusual occurred, and not enough evidence to explain what. It sits in the mind like an unfinished sentence, or a question that was asked and never answered, or a door that stands open into a room that is dark. The Atlantic has been the setting for many such doors. The Deering is the most famous American ghost ship, but she is one of a number. The Orang Medan, a Dutch vessel allegedly found in 1947 with everyone aboard dead under mysterious circumstances, though the veracity of this account has been questioned. The Joyita, a vessel found drifting in the Pacific in 1955 with her crew of 25 missing, another case of deliberate abandonment without clear explanation. The MV Derbyshire, a bulk carrier that sank in a typhoon in 1980 with 44 crew members lost, a case that was not mysterious but that took 20 years to resolve definitively through investigation. Each of these cases has its own specifics, its own evidence, its own pattern of what is known and what is not, and each of them illustrates the same fundamental truth about the sea, which is that it is large and it does not explain itself, and the things that happen on it often happen without witnesses, and the witnesses that do exist are often the sea itself, which keeps its testimony in a language that human beings have not yet learned to read. The tradition of maritime mystery is as old as seafaring, which means it is as old as human civilization's engagement with the ocean. Sailors have always known that the sea could take people and ships without explanation. They have always told stories about it. The ghost ship is one of the oldest and most persistent figures in maritime folklore. The ship that is found empty, or the ship that is glimpsed on the horizon and then cannot be found, or the ship that appears to those at sea as a warning or an omen. These stories belong to a tradition that is very ancient, that goes back through all the cultures that have depended on the sea, through all the generations of sailors who have known the truth that the sea is powerful and indifferent, and capable of taking things without asking permission or providing explanation. The ghost ship is the maritime embodiment of that truth, the visible evidence of the sea's capacity for silencing. The Deering stands in this tradition. She is a real ship with a real history and a real disappearance that was documented by real investigators. But she also belongs to the older tradition, the tradition of stories, of the ships that are found empty and the questions that follow, of the mystery that the sea creates when it takes people and leaves the vessel behind. She sails in good company. In that tradition, she sails with all the other ships whose crews are gone and whose stories have not been fully told, all the other silent hulls and cold galleys and unanswered questions that the Atlantic has collected over the centuries of human seafaring. Rest in that company. It is large and quiet, and it has been accumulating for a long time. The ships and the stories and the mysteries, all of them resting now in the history of the sea, all of them quiet, all of them done with whatever urgency they had in the moment of their happening. The ocean is very old. The mystery of the sea is very old, and you are very warm and very comfortable, and the cold Atlantic is a story, only a story, settling around you like the night, like the dark, like the long, deep quiet of the hours before dawn, when the watches change and the sea is at its most still, and the world seems to have paused to collect itself before the new day begins. Let the day pause. Let the world collect itself. Let the sea be quiet. You are here, in the warm dark, and the story is almost done, and the mystery is resting, and you can rest too. Sailors have always had their own language. Not a secret language, not a coded one, but a technical vocabulary that reflects the specific demands of a specific kind of work. The words that have accumulated around the practice of sailing vessels across the water over centuries and millennia of maritime experience. This language is one of the things that marks a sailor, that identifies someone who has spent time at sea, that signals membership in the community of people who have committed their working lives to the ocean. The vocabulary of a sailing ship is precise. The parts of the ship each have their names, and the names matter because at sea, in bad weather, in an emergency, the difference between a cleat and a belaying pin, between a halyard and a sheet, between the bow and the stern, can be the difference between getting something right and getting it catastrophically wrong. The language of the sea is not decoration. It is functional, the accumulation of centuries of experience about what needs to be said precisely and what words carry that precision most efficiently. The Carroll A, Deering was a schooner, and her particular vocabulary reflected the rigging of a schooner, the boom that carried the foot of the mainsail, the gaff that supported the top of it, the forestays and the backstays, and the shrouds that held the masts in place, the halyards that raised and lowered the sails, the sheets that controlled the angle of the sails relative to the wind. All of these words and the concepts they pointed to were the daily currency of the Deering's crew, the language they spoke when they spoke about their work. Captain Wormel would have spoken this language with the fluency of decades. He would have given orders in it, would have received reports in it, would have logged the ship's progress in the dry technical prose of the maritime log that is itself a kind of language, a form of writing developed specifically to record the information that matters on a long ocean voyage. Position, heading, wind, weather, distance made good. The log of the Carroll A, Deering, recovered from the ship when it was boarded, contains entries that speak this language. The entries are routine, the kind of entries a competent captain makes every day of a voyage, recording where the ship is and how she is doing and what the weather is. They do not contain any entries that describe distress or conflict or anything unusual. They simply stop, at a point before the ship reached Diamond Shoals, as if the captain put down his pen and did not pick it up again. A log that stops is not the same as a log that says everything is fine. A log that stops says only that the writing stopped. The reasons for the stopping are not in the log, because the reasons are the thing that ended the writing, the event that intervened between the last entry and all the entries that did not get made. Maritime investigators know how to read logs. They know that the information in a log is not only what is written but also what is absent, the days that are missing, the entries that should be there and are not, the gap between the last entry and the date when the ship was found. The Deering's log gives investigators a picture of the voyage up to a certain point and then denies them the rest. It is a document with a story told up to the moment, when the story becomes the story worth telling, and then nothing. The language of the sea also includes the language of signal, the codes and flags and sounds that ships use to communicate with each other and with shore stations. The message from the Deering to the Cape Fear lightship was transmitted by megaphone, the simplest and most direct form of ship-to-shore communication, a human voice amplified by a cone of metal calling across the water. The voice that called would have used the vocabulary of maritime communication, the specific words and phrases that carry meaning in that context. The message about lost anchors was a maritime message. In that vocabulary, anchors are important. A ship without anchors is a ship that cannot stop herself, cannot hold position in bad weather, cannot do some of the things that a seagoing vessel needs to be able to do. Losing an anchor is a serious matter, worth reporting to the relevant authorities. The message was appropriate, in its form, to the situation it described. What made the lightship crew uneasy was perhaps not the words, but the delivery, the specific human quality of the voice, the particular urgency or lack thereof, the way the words were said rather than simply the words themselves. Language communicates more than its literal content. A sailor who says we have lost our anchors in one tone of voice is reporting a navigational inconvenience. The same words in a different tone might be saying something else entirely. The lightship men could not articulate precisely what it was about the communication that struck them as unusual. They could only report that something about it seemed not quite right, that it had a quality that stayed with them. that made them remember it when the Deering was subsequently found on the shoals. The sea has its own language too, beyond the human vocabulary imposed on it. The language of wave patterns, which tell an experienced eye the history of the wind that created them. The language of cloud formations, which speak of coming weather in ways that sailors learned to read before the era of meteorological instruments. The language of the colour of the water, which changes with depth and temperature and the presence of currents. The language of the birds, whose species and behaviour are indicators of distance from land and the direction of the nearest coast. The crew of the Deering would have been reading all of these languages simultaneously, in the way that experienced sailors do, taking in the information of the sea and the sky, and synthesizing it into a continuous situational awareness that is one of the skills of the mariner. They would have known, or sensed, or read in the signs around them some version of where they were and what the sea was likely to do next. What they could not read, in the language of the sea, was what was happening among themselves. The human language on the ship, the language of the conflict between the captain and the first mate, of the crew's response to that conflict, of the decisions and decisions being made, and the consequences of those decisions. That language was interior, personal, invisible to the external observer. And it is that interior language, the language of what the people aboard the Deering were thinking and feeling and choosing in the final days of the voyage, that has been lost, not because it was not spoken, but because no one who heard it survived to report it. The language of what happened on the Deering in January 1921 is a language that was spoken and is now silent, the words absorbed by the sea and the cold and the century, gone as completely as the crew themselves. The language of the sea continues. It is spoken in the wind and the wave, in the pattern of the swell and the cry of the birds. It is spoken in the rhythm of the tides, in the pull of the current, in the cold that rises from the deep when the seasons turn. It is a language that was here before the Deering sailed, and that will be here long after every trace of her has dissolved in the salt water. The people who have made careers of understanding the sea know this language in ways that are not quite translatable into words. Marine biologists who have spent decades on research vessels, Coast Guard officers whose service has taken them through every condition the North Atlantic can produce, merchant mariners who have crossed these same waters hundreds of times, in every season, in every weather, until the sea feels like something they know personally, a character rather than a phenomenon. These people have learned the language not in the way that you learn a language from a book or a classroom, but in the way that you learn the character of a person you live with, through long exposure, through attention, through the accumulation of experience that gradually gives you the ability to read a mood or predict a behaviour, or understand what is happening before anyone has put it into words. Captain Wormel had spent decades accumulating that knowledge. He knew the language of the sea in the way that a man who has lived his life on the water knows it. He knew the North Atlantic in winter, the grey sky and the cold, and the particular behaviour of the waves in the shoal waters off the Outer Banks. He had sailed this coast before, almost certainly, had navigated these waters with the skill of long experience, had brought ships safely through these conditions more times than he could count. And yet the Deering ended up on Diamond Shoals, which tells you something about the sea's language, about how even fluency in it does not give you control over what it says. The sea speaks, and you listen, and you respond as best you can, and sometimes that is enough and sometimes it is not, and the sea does not explain the difference. We translate that language as best we can. We take the evidence and the theory and the investigation and the story, and we make from it something that carries meaning, that connects us to what happened and to the people it happened to. We make it a story, because stories are how human beings have always carried the past, always transmitted the things that happen to those who come after. This story is almost done now. The language in which it is told is winding down, the sentences growing shorter, the pace growing slower, the words choosing the ones that are softer and more restful, that carry you toward the quiet rather than toward the questions. The sea is speaking, very quietly, in its oldest language. You can hear it, or imagine you hear it, somewhere behind the voice that has been telling this story. The sound of water, the sound of wind, the sound of the world going on in its ancient way, patient and indifferent and very, very old. Rest in that sound. Let it carry you. The language of the sea is not demanding. It does not require anything of you except to receive it, to let it wash over you the way the tide washes over the sand, gently and repeatedly, until the thing that was sharp is smooth and the thing that was restless is still. There is a coast beyond Diamond Shoals, not visible from the shoals themselves, which are too far offshore to see the land distinctly, but there, nonetheless. A thin line of sand and dune and grass that is the actual barrier between the Atlantic and the American mainland. The Outer Banks, the edge of the continent. From the beach at Cape Hatteras on a clear January day you can see the shoals. The breaking waves mark them, white against the grey-green of the water, a pattern that moves and shifts but is always there, always indicating the presence of the sand below. Beyond the shoals, the ocean is open, uninterrupted, extending to the horizon and then beyond it for thousands of miles. Standing on that beach, facing east, you are at the edge of everything familiar. Behind you is the land, the roads and the houses and the mainland, the ordinary world of daily life. Before you is the sea, the ancient indifferent sea, the thing that the continent stops at, the thing that goes on where the land cannot follow. Sailors have stood at this edge and stepped off it for as long as there have been sailors. They have built their vessels on the land and then launched them into the sea and sailed away, and sometimes they have come back, and sometimes they have not. The shore watches, the sea receives. This has always been the arrangement. The families of the Deering's crew were the shore. They were the ones who watched. They watched for a ship that had sailed away in the summer of 1920 and did not return as expected, and then heard the news that the ship had been found empty, and then waited for more news, and the more news was insufficient, and the official investigation did not resolve the question, and eventually they were left with only the open space where the answer should have been. What do you do with an open space like that? How do you close around it? How do you continue your life when at the centre of it there is a question that cannot be answered? A person who did not return, and about whom you will never know what happened. People do it. They have always done it. The families of sailors have always lived with this particular kind of loss. The loss that is not confirmed loss but is absence. The loss that does not come with a body or a ceremony or a defined moment of ending. They absorb it. They carry it. They continue. Captain Wormel's wife. The families of the crew. They received the news that the Deering had been found on Diamond Shoals, that the crew was missing, that the investigation had begun. They followed the investigation as best they could, reading the reports in the newspapers, communicating with the agencies, waiting for a resolution that never came. Eventually they accepted, in the way that people accept things they cannot change, that the resolution was not coming, that the answer was not going to be provided, that the question would remain. This is its own kind of ending, not satisfying, not complete, not the ending that the people who were waiting for it deserved, but an ending, of sorts. The acceptance that some things do not resolve, that some questions do not get answered, that the sea takes what it takes, and the people on the shore are left with whatever the sea decides to leave them. It left them the ship, grounded and damaged and eventually scuttled, but the ship. It left them the log, with its record of the voyage up to the point where the record stopped. It left them the galley, with the warm stove and the uneaten meal, which became the symbol by which the Deering story would be told for 100 years. It left them the investigators' reports, the theories, the interviews, the correspondence. It did not leave them the answer. The shore beyond the shoals is quiet now. The winter light is fading, the way light fades in January, early and completely, the sun dropping below the horizon and taking the warmth of the day with it. The temperature drops when the sun goes. The wind picks up, as it often does in the evenings along the Outer Banks, the sea breeze becoming stronger as the land cools faster than the water. The lighthouse at Cape Hatteras is beginning to be visible in the gathering dark, its light not yet fully visible in the daylight, but its shape there, the familiar spiral of black and white, the tall column of it against the pale evening sky. Soon, the light itself will begin its rotation, the steady flash that has been sweeping these waters since 1870, that has marked this dangerous coast for all the ships that have passed, and all the sailors who have used it as their reference point for navigating the shoals. The Deering passed this coast. The Deering passed this lighthouse, or would have, if her passage had continued long enough to bring her within sight of it. Maybe the lighthouse was the last landmark before Diamond Shoals. Maybe someone aboard was watching for it, counting the miles remaining to port, thinking about the end of the voyage. Or maybe not. Maybe whatever had already happened by the time the ship was close enough to the lighthouse to see it. Maybe the deck was already empty, already quiet, the ship already drifting on the current that would carry her to her final resting place on the shoal. We do not know, we will not know, and here, in the warmth of the place where you are, that is all right. The not knowing is part of the story. The not knowing is, in a sense, the story. A mystery that keeps its mystery, a silence that holds its silence, a sea that keeps what it keeps. You are on the shore. You are watching the lighthouse turn. The water is grey and cold, and it stretches away from you to a horizon that is darkening into night. The stars are beginning to appear, one by one, the way they always appear when the sky is clear and the night is coming in from the east. The first star of evening, then a second, then more, until the sky is full of them. The same sky that the watch on the Deering saw, those long ago nights, the same stars in the same positions, doing the same slow sweep across the sky that they have been doing since before there were ships, or sailors, or mysteries, or stories. They do not know about the Deering. The stars do not know anything. They are just light, very old light, arriving from distances so vast that the human mind cannot hold them. They are just there, as they always are, as they will always be, long after the Deering and the Outer Banks and the Atlantic coast and everything that exists on this small planet have gone back to the materials the universe will use to build the next thing. You are very small, and the night is very large, and the story is done now, and the mystery rests. Let everything rest. Let the lighthouse turn in the dark. Let the sea move. Let the stars do their ancient slow turning. Let yourself go quiet, the way the shore goes quiet when the last of the light is gone and the night is complete. The Deering is at the bottom of the sea. The crew is wherever crews go when the sea receives them. The mystery is fixed in the past, 100 years fixed, immovable, done, and you are here, in the warmth and the dark and the quiet. That is enough. That is more than enough. Sleep. The families of sailors have always known how to wait. It is one of the skills that maritime life requires of those left on shore, a particular kind of patience that is not passive but actively practiced. A skill honed over generations of watching the horizon for returning vessels and learning to live with the uncertainty of when, or whether, the return would happen. In 1921, before the era of radio communication on commercial vessels, before the satellite positioning systems that now allow anyone to track a ship's location in real time, before the emergency beacons that activate automatically when a vessel sinks, the families of sailors lived with a great deal more uncertainty than we live with today. A ship that sailed out of port did not report its progress except when it reached another port. The weeks at sea between ports were weeks of silence, of absence, of no news at all. This was understood. It was the condition of maritime life on the shoreside as much as on the seaside. Women who had married sailors had accepted this as part of the bargain. Parents of sailors knew it. Children of sailors learned it early. The ship goes out. There is silence. The ship comes back, or it does not come back, and in either case the waiting is what happens in between. The waiting had its textures. There were good days of waiting, days when the sky was clear and the news from other ships coming into port was favourable, when there was no reason to worry and the expected arrival date was approaching. There were harder days, days when storms were reported along the route the expected ship was taking, days when the arrival date passed without the ship appearing in the harbour, days when the silence became particular rather than general. Captain Wormel's wife waited. The families of the other 9 men waited, in the summer and autumn of 1920, while the Deering was on her southward voyage and in Rio and in the Caribbean. The waiting was ordinary waiting, the kind that sailors' families know. Expected arrival dates could be estimated, and if the ship was a little late, that was within the ordinary range of maritime variability. By January of 1921, the waiting had a different quality. The Deering should have been returning. The voyage was at its end. And then the news came, not the news of the ship's arrival, but the news of the ship's finding, which was a very different kind of news that changed the quality of the waiting entirely. When you learn that a ship has been found on a shoal, empty, the waiting does not end. It transforms. It becomes waiting for news of another kind. News of what happened, news of the crew, news of the investigation. The waiting continues, but its object has changed. You are no longer waiting for the ship to come home. You are waiting for the explanation of why it is not coming home. That explanation never came. For the families of the Deering's crew, they waited through the investigation. They waited through the official reports and the agency communications and the theories that were proposed and examined and set aside. They waited through the long months and then years after the active investigation ended. And eventually, as people must, they stopped waiting in the specific sense and began carrying the unanswered question instead, the way you carry something heavy when you have been carrying it long enough that it feels like part of you. The art of waiting, as it was practiced by the families of sailors, was not simply a passive endurance. It was a form of faith. Faith that the sea, which had taken the person you loved, would eventually give back some accounting of what it had done with them. Faith that the silence would eventually become speech, that the question would eventually become answer. Sometimes that faith was rewarded, sometimes it was not. For the families of the Deering's crew it was not rewarded. The faith was not returned with the thing it had hoped for. The sea kept its accounting. The century passed. There is something in this that goes beyond the specific case of the Carroll A. Deering, something that resonates with a larger human experience, the waiting for an explanation that does not come, the expectation of resolution that never arrives, the long patience of grief that has no object to work on, no body to bury, no moment of confirmed ending to build the rebuilding from. We live in an era that values closure, that believes in the possibility and the desirability of resolution, that expects the story to end cleanly with the question answered and the mystery solved. The Deering refuses this expectation. It insists on its openness, on its unresolved quality, on the specific kind of reality that an unsolved mystery represents, which is the reality of a world that does not always give us what we need to go on. And yet the families of the Deering's crew did go on, as people do, as people must. The wife of Captain Wormel lived out her life. The families of the crew members continued their lives. Time passed for them, as it does for everyone, and they found ways to carry the open question without being destroyed by it, which is a kind of achievement that deserves acknowledgement, even at a century's distance. The art of waiting transitions, eventually, into the art of living with not knowing. It is a harder art, and less often celebrated, but it is one that human beings have practiced since before there were ships or oceans, since before there were mysteries in the formal sense. People have always had to live with not knowing what happened to someone they loved, not knowing why, not knowing whether there will ever be an answer. The sea is one of the oldest teachers of this art. It has been taking people and keeping its secrets for as long as there have been people to take, and the people left on shore have been practicing the art of living with not knowing for just as long. It is an old practice, a practiced practice, a skill that humanity has developed over millennia of maritime loss. The Carroll A. Deering is one lesson in that long curriculum, not the hardest lesson, not the most famous, not the most complete in the information it provides or withholds, but a lesson nonetheless, a specific and documented instance of the sea's capacity for silence, offered to history as an example of what the ocean can do when it decides to keep something. The lighthouse turns at Cape Hatteras. The shoals are there, in the shallows, as they have always been. The waves break over the sand in the same pattern they broke over it on the morning when Brady walked the beach and saw the Deering sitting there, empty and red-hulled and quiet in the winter light. The water is very old. The shore is very old. The art of waiting is very old. And you are here, in the warmth of this present moment, carried safely through the story to a place where you can let it rest. Rest with it. Let the waiting be over for tonight. Let the mystery be at peace. Let the sea be what it is, the great quiet presence at the edge of the continent, holding what it holds, keeping what it keeps, moving in its ancient rhythm, independent of all human inquiry. The story is in the water now. It has always been in the water, and you can rest on the shore of it, in the warmth and the dark, and let the water do what water does, which is to move and to be present and to be, fundamentally, at peace with itself and with everything it contains. That peace is available to you too. It is right here. It has always been right here. You only need to stop moving toward it and let it arrive. In any investigation, the evidence is never everything that happened. It is only the residue of what happened, the material that survived, the traces that were preserved by whatever combination of circumstances conspired to make them accessible to later inquiry. The full reality of what occurred is always larger than the evidence. always richer, always more specific, always more human than the bare record that investigators are left with. The evidence in the Carroll A Deering case is both more than many similar cases produce and less than what is needed to resolve it. More, because the ship herself was found intact, because the physical details of what the boarding party discovered were recorded and analysed and preserved in the official record. Less, because the central question of what happened to the crew cannot be answered from what was found, because the human beings at the centre of the story left no statement, no witness, no testimony that survived their disappearance. Evidence is a strange category of thing. It is not truth, exactly. It is not the event itself. It is the material relationship between the event and the present moment, the thread of physical reality that connects what happened then to the inquiry happening now. Some of that thread is robust, surviving time and weather and the dissolution of materials that time and weather produce. Some of it is fragile, destroyed by the very processes that were set in motion when the thing it was evidence of occurred. The warm stove, for instance. The warmth of the stove was evidence. Not the stove itself, which was a piece of iron that had been in that galley since the ship was built, but the warmth of it, the temperature that indicated recent use, the heat that had not yet dissipated. That evidence existed for a specific and limited period after the crew disappeared. Every hour that passed after whatever happened reduced the warmth. By the time the boarding party reached the ship, 2 days after Brady saw her on the Shoals, the stove was warm but not hot. Another day and it would have been cold. The evidence of recent use gone, the stove just a stove. The specificity of that timing is one of the more haunting details of the case. If the Coast Guard had been able to reach the ship on the first day, while the sea was still too rough, the stove might have told them more. If they had arrived a day later, the stove might have told them nothing. The window of evidence was narrow, and what survived into it was a function of accident as much as design. The same is true of the food on the stove. Whatever Herbert Bates was preparing had a shelf life, a period during which it retained the quality of recently made food rather than old food that had been sitting for days. By the time the boarding party arrived, 2 days after the Deering grounded, the food was presumably no longer warm, was perhaps beginning to show signs of deterioration. But it was still there, still recognizable as a prepared meal, still telling the story of a cook who had been in the middle of his work. 2 days is a specific amount of time. It places the disappearance of the crew at most 2 days before the ship was found, and in reality, probably less, since the ship had to be in motion under some kind of management until she ran onto the Shoals. The Shoals were reached presumably in the overnight hours of January 30 to 31. Brady saw her in the morning of January 31. The disappearance of the crew was therefore probably within a day or two of the ship's grounding, and possibly very shortly before it. This is not much of a window. The waters between the Cape Fear lightship, where the Deering was last seen by a third party, and Diamond Shoals are perhaps 30 to 40 miles apart. A sailing vessel making moderate progress in the January winds would cover that distance in a matter of hours, not days. The time between the Cape Fear sighting and the grounding was probably measured in hours, which means that whatever happened in a few hours. The crew did not vanish over the course of a long, slow deterioration. The situation changed rapidly, or the event was sudden, or both. 10 people were on that ship when she passed the Cape Fear lightship, or some of them were, and however many hours later, the ship was on Diamond Shoals and empty. That compressed time frame is consistent with several of the theories, but inconsistent with others. A slow-burning mutiny that took place over days does not fit a time frame of hours. A sudden catastrophe, whether natural or human, fits much better. Something changed fast. Something happened that removed the crew from the ship in a short period of time, leaving behind the warm stove and the prepared meal as evidence of how recent that removal was. The cut anchor chains also speak to speed. Cutting anchor chains is not a careful, deliberate operation. It is an emergency operation, done with a tool applied to metal with urgency, done because waiting to release the chains in the normal way would take too long. Cut anchor chains are evidence of a situation in which speed was important, in which normal procedures were abandoned in favour of something faster. The combination of the cut chains, the disabled steering, the missing navigation instruments, and the abandoned meal creates a picture of a ship in a state of urgent transition, a ship being made uninhabitable or uncontrollable as quickly as possible while simultaneously being the site of a meal preparation that suggests normal life was happening right up until the moment of transition. How do you reconcile these two things? The ordinary meal preparation and the deliberate destruction of navigational capacity? You reconcile them by positing that they did not happen simultaneously. The meal was being prepared before whatever event caused the chains to be cut and the steering to be disabled. The event interrupted the meal. The event transformed the ship from a normal working vessel to something else. Whatever it was in those final hours before the boarding party arrived. The event. The word keeps recurring because it is the only word adequate to the gap in the evidence. Something happened. The something is the event. The event is what the evidence cannot name. The investigators spent months in rooms full of paper, reading the testimony of harbour masters and consular officials and sailors who had worked with McClellan or Warmel or any of the 10 men whose names appeared on the Deering's crew manifest. They sent letters to other governments, through the State Department, asking about ships that had been in the same waters at the same time. They tried to reconstruct the Deering's route from the Cape Fear sighting to Diamond Shoals using the evidence of the ship's log, which was itself absent, and the external accounts of the lightship crew, which were limited to what they had seen from a distance through a winter haze. They were thorough people doing thorough work in a situation where thoroughness was not sufficient, where the thing they were looking for had not left enough behind to be found. The investigators could not name it. The theorists who have come after them have proposed names for it: mutiny, piracy, rum-running, rogue waves, supernatural causes, but names are not the same as evidence. Names are the shapes we give to the gap when we cannot fill it. The gap remains. In the evidence, in the record, in the story itself. The gap is the shape of the mystery, the space that no theory has been able to fill convincingly, the question that has been asked for 100 years and has not been answered. There is a certain freedom in that, if you can find it. A certain liberation in the acknowledged gap, in the mystery that is not trying to resolve itself, that has made its peace with being open. The Carroll A. Deering has been at the bottom of the sea for most of a century. The crew has been wherever they have been for a century. The gap has been there all along, and nothing has filled it, and the world has continued. Gaps persist. Mysteries remain. The sea keeps its secrets, and the world continues anyway, in its strange and imperfect and beautiful way, with all its unsolved mysteries and all its unanswered questions, with all its warm stoves and empty ships and cold winter oceans and lighthouse beams sweeping through the dark. You are part of that Messier world. You are here, in the warmth, with the story settling around you. You do not need to solve anything tonight. You do not need to fill any gaps or answer any questions. You only need to be here, in this comfortable dark, letting the story move through you and away from you, like water through your hands, like the tide through the gap between the shoals. The tide goes in and the tide goes out. The lighthouse turns. The sea moves in its ancient slow way, and you rest. And the mystery rests with you, quiet and undemanding, a companion that asks nothing except to be acknowledged, to be heard, to be carried for a little while in the imagination before being set down and allowed to return to the deep water where it lives. Let us spend some time with the 10 men themselves, not as an investigation might consider them, as witnesses or suspects or data points in an evidentiary record, but as people, as the specific individuals they were, in the specific lives they had lived before the Carroll A. Deering put to sea in 1920. Willis Wormel was born in 1854, which means he was 66 years old at the time of the Deering's last voyage. 66 years old, and not in good health, and yet still sailing, still commanding ships, still going to sea in the way that men of his generation went to sea, which is to say as a matter of course, as the thing they did, as the life they had built over decades of maritime service. He was from Maine, as many of the maritime men of the eastern seaboard were from Maine, that cold and rocky state whose coastline has always bred sailors the way flat land breeds farmers. He would have grown up with the sea as a constant. Maine in the 1860s and 1870s was a maritime state in a way that is hard to imagine now, when the fishing industry and the commercial shipping industry have both diminished from what they once were. The harbours of Maine in Wormel's childhood were busy with working vessels, the wharves piled with lumber and fish, and the other commodities that the ocean trade moved. Boys in Maine learned to sail young, learned the smell and feel and sound of a working harbour young, grew up with the knowledge that the sea was the way things worked, the way commerce moved, the way a man made his living if he was going to make a living in that part of the world. Wormel had spent his career working up through the ranks of maritime command, from ordinary seaman to mate to captain, the standard progression in the commercial sailing industry of the era, each step requiring demonstrated competence and the recommendation of those who had sailed with you. By 1920, he was an experienced and respected captain, though perhaps past his physical prime, perhaps less able to impose his authority by the sheer force of presence that a younger captain might command. His decision to take the Deering command despite his health concerns tells you something about him. About the kind of man he was, the kind of professional identity he had built over a lifetime of maritime service. He was not the sort of man who stepped back from a command because the situation was difficult. He was the sort of man who took the command and dealt with the difficulty as it arose, even when the dealing was imperfect, even when the dealing produced an outcome like the one he faced with McClellan. Charles McClellan, the first mate, is a harder figure to know at this distance. He is present in the record primarily through the accounts of people who found him difficult, who were alarmed by his behaviour, who reported his statements to investigators. This is not a full picture of a person. It is the picture that a particular set of circumstances produced, the picture of a man in conflict, which is not the same as the picture of a man in ordinary life. What made McClellan difficult? The investigation did not fully resolve this question. He had a history of conflict in maritime contexts. He was apparently prone to insubordination, apparently prone to drinking to excess at times and in ways that caused problems, apparently prone to the kind of volatile behaviour that creates disruption in close-quarters environments like a ship. These are the characteristics of a certain type of difficult person, but they do not fully explain a first mate who would apparently threaten his captain. There is something in McClellan that the record does not reach, some interior experience of frustration or grievance or fear or ambition that produced the behaviour others witnessed. He was not, presumably, simply a villain in the narrative sense. He was a person with his own reasons, his own history, his own version of the events on the Deering that would probably look different from the version Captain Wormel gave to the consul in Barbados. Herbert Bates, the cook, has a particular poignancy in the Deering story. He is present in the mystery through his work, through the meal that was found still on the stove, through the act of preparation that became the symbol of the interrupted ordinary, but he is otherwise almost entirely absent from the record. The investigation does not produce much about Bates as a person, about his history or his background or his family or his reasons for being aboard the Deering. He was doing his job. That is what is known. He was in the galley, with the stove and the pots and the ingredients, doing the thing he did every day on a long voyage, making food for the crew. He was competent enough at it to have been hired. He was present enough in the minds of those who boarded the ship that his absence was noted in relation to his work, the cook's stove warm and the cook's food on it, and the cook nowhere to be found. The 7 remaining crew members are even more obscure in the record. They are names, ages where available, maritime labour pool entries, the minimal biographical data that the investigation collected in its attempt to understand who these people were and whether anything in their histories might explain what happened to them. What can be said of them is that they were ordinary working men of the Eastern maritime trade, men who had learned a skilled profession and practiced it, men who, for various reasons, were available to sign on for the Deering's voyage in the summer of 1920. Some of them were young, probably. Some of them perhaps experienced. Some of them had families, perhaps parents or wives or children, who received the news of the Deering's discovery and waited for more news that did not come. 10 people. Not abstractions, not data, people. The investigation was conducted in their names, but it was conducted in the way that official investigations are conducted, at a remove from the personal, in the language of evidence and theory and agency jurisdiction, not in the language of grief or of the specific human loss that the disappearance represented. The officials who interviewed the families and examined the ship and filed the reports were doing their jobs, and doing them thoroughly. But their jobs required a kind of professional distance from the human reality of the case that the human reality of the case did not always allow. The families of 10 men were waiting. The investigation was proceeding. These two things existed in parallel, connected by the formal communications that agencies sent to next of kin, but separated by the vast distance between official inquiry and personal devastation. Think of that distance for a moment. The official report that notes the temperature of the galley stove and the condition of the anchor chains and the state of the navigation instruments. And across from that report, the wife of Willis Warmell, reading whatever she was told about the investigation, trying to understand what had happened to the man she had married, the man who had spent his life at sea and who had now apparently left the world by the sea's means. The report does not contain her. She is not in the evidence. She is in the gap, in the part of the story that the investigation did not reach, in the human experience that the evidentiary record cannot capture, because it has no category for it. 10 people, and the people who loved them. That is the full circumference of the Deering story. The ship and the sea and the investigation are the frame. The 10 people and the people who loved them are what the frame contains. We know the frame. We do not know the full content. The content is in the sea, which is where the Carroll A. Deering and her crew are, in the one form or another that the sea takes the things it receives. And here, in the warmth and the dark and the quiet, we hold the frame gently, aware of what it contained, grateful for what the record has preserved, accepting of what has not survived. 10 people. The sea received them. A century has passed. They were here. That is what the record says. In the end, more certainly than it says anything else. They were here. They existed. They sailed and worked and worried and hoped and cooked meals and stood watches and looked at the same winter stars that you would see if you went outside tonight and looked up. They were here, and then they were not, and the not here is the mystery. And the mystery is what remains. Rest with what remains. The Atlantic Ocean makes a particular sound when you are close to it. Not the dramatic sound of storm waves breaking against a rocky coast, not the theatrical sound that the ocean makes in movies and documentaries. The ordinary sound, the sound of the ocean when the weather is moderate and the sea is running in its usual winter pattern, the sound that the surf makes when it runs up a sandy beach and recedes, the hiss and the sigh of it, the rolling of pebbles or the softer sound of sand moving back into water. This sound is one of the oldest sounds in the world, older than any human sound, older than any human memory. The sound of the ocean on its shores has been making itself since there were shores to make it on, since the configuration of land and sea settled into something like its present arrangement tens of millions of years ago. Countless generations of living things have heard this sound, from the first creatures that moved out of the sea onto the land, to the insects and birds that have inhabited the coastal margins for millions of years, to the first human beings who came to these shores and heard the same sound that you can hear if you stand on the beach at Cape Hatteras today. It is a sleep sound. This is not a metaphor or a commercial for coastal vacations. It is a description of what the sound does to the human nervous system, the rhythm of the surf, the regular and irregular alternation of wave and recession, of the sound building and falling and building again, approximates the rhythm of certain brainwave states that the body moves through in the transition from wakefulness to sleep. The sound of the ocean is literally, physiologically, a sound that the body is prepared to relax into. Sailors know this. They know the paradox that the sea, which can be the most wakeful and alarming environment imaginable in bad weather, is also, in moderate conditions, one of the most conducive environments for sleep that exists. The motion of a ship on a calm sea, the regular roll and rise, the sound of the water against the hull, the rhythm of the vessel's progress through the water, these things together create a sensory environment that the body reads as safe and regular, an environment in which the need for vigilance can be reduced and the need for rest can be answered. The crew of the Carroll A. Deering slept to these sounds for the months of their voyage. The nights below deck, in the forecastle bunks, with the ship moving around them and the ocean making its sounds against the hull and the rigging singing in whatever wind was present, these were not luxurious sleeping conditions. The bunks were narrow, the air was probably damp, the sounds of the ship and the sea were constant and sometimes intrusive, but the body adapts. The body finds in familiar sounds the signal for rest, and the sound of the sea becomes, for those who live near it long enough, the sound of permission to sleep. The sound of deep water is different from the sound of shallow water. In the open ocean, far from any shore, the sound of the sea is not the sound of breaking surf. It is a deeper sound, a more sustained and less rhythmically varied sound. The sound of large bodies of water moving in large, slow patterns, The sound of the swell that has travelled hundreds of miles to arrive at its destination. The Deering moved through these sounds for weeks, in the open Atlantic, the deep Atlantic south of the Gulf Stream, and then in the stream itself, and then in the colder water north of the stream. The sounds changed as the ship moved north. The quality of the wind changed, its temperature and its gustiness. The sound of the rigging in the wind changed with the wind's character, the singing and the groaning of rope and wood responding to the specific frequency and force of whatever the air was doing. These are the sounds of a working sailing vessel. Not romantic sounds particularly, not the sounds of the sea as it appears in literature and film, but real sounds. The sounds of actual maritime life, the soundtrack of the Deering's last voyage. The galley added its sounds to the ship's own. The clank and the hiss of the coal stove, the particular sounds of cooking, the movement of pots and utensils, the sound of food being prepared in the way food sounds when it is being prepared, the sizzle and the bubble and the dull thud of a knife on a cutting surface, the sounds of the cook doing his work, the sounds of the most ordinary and necessary human activity, the preparation of food, happening inside the larger sounds of the ship and the sea. And then, those sounds stopping, in whatever way they stopped, whatever event or sequence of events caused the sounds of human habitation to end on that ship. The stove would have continued for a while. The food would have continued to cook until the fuel was gone, or the stove was too low to maintain the heat. The ship's sounds would have continued, because the ship continued to exist, continued to move through the water, continued to respond to the wind in her sails and the current under her hull. But the human sounds would have ended. The voices, the footsteps on the deck, the sounds of the watch changing and the men going below and the cook in the galley, all of those sounds would have ended at whatever moment the crew was no longer present to make them. What would the ship have sounded like in those hours between the crew's departure and the boarding party's arrival? The rigging moving in the wind, the hull working against the shoal, the sea around her, cold and indifferent, making its own sounds on the red hull and in the shallows of the shoal. The gull, perhaps, calling overhead, that particular cry that gulls make when they are investigating something that does not match their expectation. The empty ship, making the sounds of a ship, with no one to hear them. There is something about an empty space that still makes the sounds it made when it was inhabited. It is one of the things that make abandoned places feel haunted, not in the supernatural sense but in the acoustic sense. The way a room that has been full of life retains a particular quality of resonance, a quality that differs from a room that has never been inhabited. Sound shapes the spaces it moves through, even when the sources of the sound are gone. The Deering spaces had been full of the sounds of 10 people living and working for months. The sounds were gone with the people, but the ship still held, in whatever material sense a ship can hold things, the memory of having been inhabited. The worn places on the deck where feet had moved, the handling marks on the wheel, the particular arrangement of things in the galley that told the story of how the cook had arranged his workspace for efficiency, the evidence of habitation, written not in words but in the material record of daily use. The boarding party read these things, not consciously, not as deliberate interpretation, but in the way that people read spaces, in the way that experienced investigators read scenes, absorbing the details and constructing from them a sense of what had been here and how recently it had been here. The warm stove said recent. The arranged meal said interrupted. The absence of any sign of panic or struggle said something else, something harder to articulate, something that might be described as orderly absence rather than chaotic departure. Orderly absence. The phrase captures something about the Deering that is one of the most puzzling aspects of the mystery. The ship was not a scene of obvious violence. It was not chaotic in the way that a ship taken by a sudden storm might be chaotic. It was, in most respects, a ship that appeared to have been in good order at the moment when the crew left it. The deliberate damage to the navigation and steering was clearly purposeful, but even that was controlled damage, targeted, specific. Not the destruction of a ship in crisis, but the methodical disabling of a ship by someone who knew what they were doing and was doing it with a particular purpose. Consider the other ships that were on the Atlantic in those same days, moving through the same waters, navigating the same coast, arriving safely at their destinations. The records of the Coast Guard and the maritime authorities show that the Deering was not the only vessel on this stretch of coast in late January 1921. Other ships passed these waters in those same days without incident, arrived at their ports, discharged their cargoes, signed off their crews, and disappeared into the ordinary record of commerce that is the background noise of maritime history. They were not mysterious. They did not become famous. Their meals were eaten and their logs were completed and their crews dispersed into the ordinary life of the shore, without any particular mark on the historical record. The Carroll A. Deering is the exception. The Carroll A. Deering is the ship that did not arrive, the voyage that did not end in the ordinary way, the crew that did not sign off and go home. The Deering is the ship that asks a question instead of delivering an answer, that arrives at its destination in the wrong condition, empty and broken and full of silence. The other ships of that January are forgotten because they succeeded. The Deering is remembered because it failed, in a particular way that has kept people asking questions for a century. There is a version of maritime history that is all the other ships, the ones that made it, the ordinary voyages that accumulated into the record of commerce. And there is this, the ship that did not make it, the voyage that ended on Diamond Shoals, the absence that became a presence in the historical record precisely because of what it lacked. The Deering is present in history because she is empty. She is memorable because she is missing. That is a particular kind of immortality. Not the immortality of achievement or discovery or triumph, but the immortality of the unanswered question, the mystery that keeps itself open, the story that will not close. 100 years on, people are still writing about the Carroll A. Deering. People are still reading about her. People are still, in the late evening or the quiet night, turning over the evidence and the theories and the possibilities, trying to understand what happened in those final hours. The sound of the sea around the Deering on those January nights and days when she sat on Diamond Shoals is the sound you can hear when you close your eyes and imagine it. The winter Atlantic, grey and cold, the waves running over the shoal, the ship's hull moving slightly against the sand, the wind in the rigging, the call of a gull. That sound carries everything that needs to be carried and answers nothing that needs to be answered. It is the sound of the mystery itself, perhaps. The sound of something that happened and was absorbed and is now simply there, simply present in the ocean and the wind and the cold grey light of a January morning 100 years ago and every morning since. Listen to it. Let it be the last sound of this part of the story, the sound of the sea that holds the mystery, cold and patient and absolutely indifferent to whether we ever understand what it holds. It is enough to know that it holds something. It is enough to know that the sea is there, and that the mystery is there within it, and that we have spent this time together turning it over in the dark, looking at its facets, listening to its sounds, trying to understand its shape. The sea breathes, slowly, in and out. The tide goes in and the tide comes out. The waves run up the beach and recede, and somewhere in all of that movement, the truth of the Carroll A. Deering sleeps deep and quiet with the patience of the ocean itself. There is a tradition in maritime law and maritime inquiry that holds that the sea is always the first suspect when things go wrong. Before you blame the captain, blame the weather. Before you blame the crew, blame the condition of the vessel. Before you attribute to human action what can be explained by the sea's ordinary violence, apply the sea's explanation first and see if it fits. Thanks for watching. It is a tradition born of hard experience, of investigations that began by assuming human fault and ended by discovering that the sea had simply done what the sea does, without any human assistance or intention. The Carroll A. Deering investigation did not fully follow this tradition. The investigators moved quickly, understandably, toward theories involving human action, because the evidence seemed to demand it. The cut chains, the disabled steering, the missing crew. These things are not what the sea produces by itself in the ordinary course of its violence. Or so the investigators reasoned. And their reasoning was not unreasonable. But what if they moved too quickly? What if the first interpreter of each piece of evidence brought assumptions to the interpretation that closed off other possibilities before they could be properly considered? Every theory about the Carroll A. Deering begins with the same assumption, that the evidence found on the ship is accurately recorded and accurately interpreted, that the cut anchor chains are what they appear to be, that the warm stove means what the investigators thought it meant, that the disabled steering is evidence of deliberate sabotage rather than storm damage or mechanical failure that happened to look deliberate. What if some of these assumptions are wrong? This is not a comfortable question to ask, because the alternative explanations it opens up are in some ways less satisfying than the ones that rest on the existing interpretation. But it is a question worth asking, because the history of investigation is full of cases where evidence was misread, where the initial interpretation proved incorrect, where the facts were right but the meaning attached to them was wrong. The cut anchor chains, for example. Could they have been damaged in a way that looked like cutting but was not? Under certain conditions of stress and corrosion, a chain can fail in ways that produce clean-looking breaks rather than the torn or frayed breaks that are more obviously accidental. If the anchors had been deployed in bad weather and then lost under stress, the chains might have failed cleanly rather than messily. The investigators concluded the chains were cut, and they had reason to, but the interpretation of physical evidence under maritime conditions is not always straightforward. The disabled steering. Could the damage have been caused by the grounding itself rather than by deliberate action before the grounding? A ship that runs hard onto a shoal can sustain damage to its underwater fittings, including the rudder hardware, in ways that might subsequently appear deliberate to an inspector who does not know exactly how the grounding occurred. The boarding party arrived 2 days after the grounding. 2 days in which the sea was working on a grounded vessel, in which the motion of the hull against the shoal was producing stresses on every fitting. The missing navigation instruments. This is the detail that most resists innocent explanation. Compasses do not simply disappear. They are mounted in their binnacles, and they stay there unless someone removes them. No storm, no grounding, no mechanical failure produces missing compasses. If the investigators correctly recorded that the navigation instruments were absent, then human agency was involved in their removal. This detail, more than any other, insists on the human dimension of the Deering mystery. But even here the question can be asked: who removed them, and why, and when? The most dramatic answer is that they were removed by whoever took the crew to prevent navigation, to confuse the evidence, to do whatever removing compasses accomplishes in the context of the crisis that produced the Deering mystery. But another answer is possible. The crew removed them. If the crew was preparing to abandon ship, they might have taken the navigation instruments with them as useful tools for whatever vessel they were transferring to or whatever boats they were rowing to shore in. This answer has its own problems. If the crew abandoned ship and took the compasses with them, the compasses should have been findable later, either with the crew if they were found, or in the lifeboats, or somewhere along the Outer Banks where the lifeboats might have landed. No compasses were found, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the Carolina coast in January 1921 was not perfectly searched. The theories accumulate and dissolve, and accumulate again around the fixed points of the evidence, like sea foam around the pilings of a dock. Each theory makes sense of some of the evidence and leaves other evidence unexplained. No theory accounts for everything. And this, in the end, is what makes the Deering case what it is. Not a mystery that resists all explanation, but a mystery where every explanation is partial, where the evidence is just sufficient to rule out simple accidents and insufficient to confirm any of the more complex explanations that have been proposed. The partial explanation is in some ways more maddening than no explanation at all. If the Deering had simply disappeared, gone down without a trace in deep water with no evidence of any kind, the mystery would be of a different quality, the quality of a complete silence, a void rather than a puzzle. Instead, the Deering left evidence, and the evidence is enough to say something happened, and not enough to say what. This is the specific cruelty of the Deering case. It is not the cruelty of the storm that swallows a ship whole. It is the cruelty of the partial witness, the testimony that begins and does not finish, the sentence left incomplete. And yet, there is a strange grace in it too. The incompleteness of the Deering case has kept the 10 people aboard her present in the world in a way that a complete disaster would not have. If the Deering had gone down cleanly, with all hands, with a known cause, she would be one entry among thousands in the record of maritime disasters, mourned and then filed, part of the statistical reality of the sea's dangers. Instead, because the mystery persists, because no one has been able to close the file with a satisfying explanation, the Deering and her crew remain present, remain a matter of active consideration, remain the subject of stories told 100 years after they sailed. There is a kind of immortality in that. Not the immortality that anyone would choose, not the immortality of achievement or legacy in the ordinary sense, the immortality of the unresolved, the persistence of the open question. Willis Wormel and Charles McClellan and Herbert Bates and the 7 others whose names are in the record remain present because their story is not finished, because the account of what happened to them has not been closed, because the world is still, in a sense, waiting for the answer that the sea has not provided. The answer may never come. The evidence that would provide it is almost certainly beyond recovery, dissolved or dispersed or buried too deep in the Atlantic to be reached by any technology currently available or imaginable. The Deering case may be one of those mysteries that simply endures, generation after generation, because the ocean is large and patient and does not feel the obligation to explain itself. That is all right. It is more than all right. It is, in its way, a testament to the scale and the patience of the natural world, a reminder that there are things in this world larger and older and more patient than human inquiry, things that exist on their own terms and according to their own purposes, without reference to what we need from them. The sea is one of those things. The sea is very large. The sea is very old. The sea has been holding its secrets since before there were people to wonder about them, and it will be holding them long after the wondering is done. Tonight, you are part of the wondering, and the wondering is gentle, and it asks nothing of you except to receive it, to let it move through you in the way that stories move through us, leaving behind whatever they leave behind. What does this story leave behind? A ship, a crew, a winter coast, a meal, a warm stove, a mystery, and the sea, always the sea, moving in its old way, holding its old secrets, patient as stone, ancient as time itself. You can rest now. The wondering is done for tonight. The mystery is patient. It will wait for you. It has been waiting for 100 years, and it can wait a little longer while you sleep. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this one, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. And now, as the story settles into the dark behind us, let yourself go with it. You are somewhere warm, somewhere safe. The cold Atlantic is very far away, and the grey winter sea is only a story now, only the fading impression of a voice that has moved through the room and gone quiet. Let your breathing slow. There is nothing to do right now. Nothing to remember, nothing to plan, nothing to hold on to. The story has been told, the mystery is still a mystery. That is all right. That is more than all right. Some things do not resolve, and in the deep quiet of the night, in the warmth of where you are, that is its own kind of peace. Not every question has an answer. Not every ship makes port. Not every ending is an ending. The lighthouse turns somewhere in the dark, the sea moves, the shoals are quiet under the winter sky. You are not there. You are here. Here is warm. Here is still. Here is the sound of your own breathing, the rhythm of it, the way it slows when nothing is asked of it, the way the body knows, without being told, how to rest when rest is permitted. Let it slow. Let it slow. The Carroll A. Deering sailed north in January of a year long ago, and the sea received her, and what happened between those two things is a mystery that has kept its secret for a century and will keep it for another. It is a gentle mystery now. It has had 100 years to become gentle. The edges are worn smooth, the urgency is gone. What remains is only the shape of it, the outline of something that happened and was never fully explained, drifting quietly at the edge of sleep like a ship on the current, going where the water takes it. Let that image carry you. A ship on a dark sea, moving without hurry. No one at the helm, but the current knowing where to go, the water knowing the way, the slow drift of everything toward the quiet place where things come to rest. That is where you are going. That is where you are already. The story is done, the mystery is still. The sea is dark and cold and very far away, and here is warm, and here is quiet, and here is the last of the voice, saying only this: sleep well, sleep deeply. The ship is at rest, the sea is at rest. You can rest too. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. I am always curious about that, and if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. Until next time,